Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining the strangest events, unquestioned history. We have numerous historical events that have many anomalies in them. We're going to be looking at some select events today in this exploration, and we're going to see exactly what odd things have occurred in these historical events. And yet at the same time, these events are unquestioned, they are well documented, and they have brought us to the present. Let's begin our exploration. We begin by examining the Know Nothing movement, or the American Party, also known as the Native American Party, 1844 to 1860. This was a nativist party. Now, American politics have always been very intriguing and yet at the same time very simplistic, as there's always primarily been two parties, from the very incipience of the nation. This particular nativist party, though, was founded, yes, they even use that terminology for a political party, in 1844 to promote the rights of what they called Native Americans. Not what Native Americans are referred to today, but Native Americans in the mid-19th century, who were Protestant Americans. They were concerned about the sudden influx of immigrants from Ireland and Germany, primarily Catholic, because in their minds, the Catholic Church was a separate authority that was not under the secular authority that was legitimate American authority. So they founded this political party in 1844 to appeal to the good nature of Native Americans to oppose all this immigration. Now, why was this sudden immigration coming from Ireland and Germany? We're told that there was a potato famine in Ireland, and we're told there was a lot of social injustice in Germany. The revolutions of 1848, which the channel previously explored in the Reset War of 1848. So what was really going on? Well, it seems as though this political party was a very foundational movement to propagate the rights of people who viewed themselves as Native Americans, or nativists. And indeed, our good friends over at the Smithsonian Magazine are quick to point out that native sentiments or nativist sentiments are very incorrect, and that it is very foolhardy to embrace any sort of anti-immigration platform. What's unique about the Know Nothing Party, though, is just how briefly it existed. We have accounts of immigrants being attacked who worked on the Erie Canal, and this was back in the 1820s in New York, and yet at the same time it didn't seem to hinder the construction of the Erie Canal. We're also well aware of the fact that Irish and Germans make up the vast majority of many of the great cities that we've explored, and that they're responsible for building the cities. I mean, if I had a cent for every time someone told me about how Germans took part in the construction of Cincinnati. But isn't it interesting how we supposedly had this political party from 1844 to 1860, who's even reputed to have engaged in many violent acts against members of these immigrants in many of the cities that we've explored, and we did recount that in certain situations, such as in Louisville. But how exactly did a bunch of Germans end up in Cincinnati if there was this political party that was opposed to them, and yet they seemed to be able to continue to flourish and build the wonderful city that we saw? KN ticket, isn't that very interesting? Now, of course, we can see the parallels with at least what is presented to us of politics in America today, about how the whole concept of nativism and resisting immigration is totally incorrect and nobody should embrace it. It's very fascinating, though, that the exact same political principle that was in existence before the Civil War is still one of the primary political principles that's in existence now. And the other interesting thing is the Know Nothing Party's antipathy towards the Pope. It should be noted that during that time, the official history tells us that the Kingdom of Italy was snagging land from the Papal States until the Pope was pretty much confined to the Vatican. We checked that out in the Vatican exploration. But what was really the aim of this political party? It's hard to say in full terms what they were trying to do, because where the real historical anomalies come from is the fact that this political party was very short-lived. It was a really odd time in American political history, because while so many of us are more familiar with the two-party system, or the bipartisan system, which is what we all know we'll live and die by, because, if you had a third major political party in the United States, people might be a little confused. Things are either right or they're wrong. You either agree with them or you disagree with them, and you shouldn't think anywhere beyond those lines. And we're also told that this nativist party, the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, or the Native American Party, or whatever name you want to call it, was really one of the foundational events that caused America to go to its bipartisan system. Indeed, the end of the Know Nothing Party came about from the United States Civil War, and we're told that they couldn't really agree upon their platform with slavery, because when most of them joined the Republican Party, at least back during this time frame, was opposed to slavery. In fact, they even called many Republicans who opposed slavery radical Republicans, and so on and so forth. And so, just like that, that was the end of the Know Nothing Party. They had no platform, and they simply evaporated. The U.S. Civil War comes along, and then the next thing you know, you have Irish brigades fighting each other on opposite battles in North and South. So what are your thoughts on the Know Nothing Party? What do you think it really represented? What was it all really about? And why did it just simply vanish, with nobody really protesting? We now consider the story of James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense in the United States. James Forrestal came from a very strong Irish Catholic family, indeed the very people that the Know Nothing Party apparently opposed. He grew up and he had a strict sense of discipline and eventually made a name for himself as a financier on Wall Street. Finally, he rose to the position of Secretary of the Navy during World War II under the Roosevelt administration, and then eventually became the first nation Secretary of Defense. This is the house he lived in, a nice little old world house in Washington, D.C., the Prospect House, built in 1788. Some very nice brickwork on it. But going back to the story of James Forrestal, when he was initially appointed as Secretary of the Navy during World War II, he oversaw one of the largest and most effective shipbuilding programs in the history of the known lands. We'll look at shipbuilding figures when we look at the sudden expansion of the United States Navy as another one of our historical anomalies. Forrestal was a proponent of the Carrier Battle Group, now called the Carrier Strike Group, the Navy being centered around large aircraft carriers with many supporting ships, and being able to project expeditionary power across the lands. However, Forrestal was not a full supporter of the New Deal, at least it was stated he did not champion it. Additionally, he came to odds with his President Harry S. Truman, in terms of the management of the armed forces. Indeed, Forrestal opposed the creation of a Department of Defense and preferred the old War Department. Interestingly enough, when you consider the United States military's record since it's been under the Department of Defense. Regardless, Forrestal was a very effective Secretary of Defense, being able to work with many different people, and he tried to oppose the crippling of the United States military, or at least the vast reduction that occurred at the end of World War II. Forrestal stated that the United States faced a grave threat from the Soviet Union, and that the threat of expansion from the communist powers needed to be checked. The other intriguing aspect is when we consider the fact that not only was the United States military very rapidly reduced after World War II, there are even accounts of equipment simply being tossed overboard from ships, much in the same way as we remember steam locomotive engines being crashed into each other at the start of the 20th century, and we even have video footage of that. Well, there's a lot of footage that indicate that a lot of military surplus equipment was lost simply because the government didn't make money to store it. Forrestal also ran afoul of Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson was a journalist for one of our favorite periodicals, the Washington Post. Drew Pearson was critical of Forrestal, as he felt that Forrestal did not adequately support the partition of Palestine plan, which had ended World War II. Forrestal argued that if the partition of Palestine was carried out, that it would anger many of the Arab states which the United States was reliant on for oil. However, Pearson criticized Forrestal, saying that this was not the right viewpoint to have, and as a result of which Forrestal lost a lot of credibility with President Truman. And indeed, he also paid for it in other ways. Pearson would run afoul of problems of his own, though, when he'd come across Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin as they engaged in a fist fight in 1950. It stated that Pearson lost because McCarthy caught him off guard. Very interesting series of events, though, is that Drew Pearson, despite having known communist sympathizers on his actual staff, he was never investigated by the House Un-American Committee, and getting into a fight with the very senator who led the Red Scare tactics of the 1950s, he was never investigated. In fact, he was saved by Richard Nixon in his little fist fight with Joseph McCarthy. We have many images, though, that show Drew Pearson meeting with subsequent U.S. President Lyndon Johnson. So what exactly is going on here? It's very hard to say. Why wasn't Drew Pearson ever more stringently investigated? Why was a journalist allowed to run around and seemingly dictate U.S. policy? Back to James Forrestal, he ran into other issues when he continued to challenge the policies of President Truman and President Truman's failure to fund the armed forces. Indeed, the United States armed forces were left in a very state of depreciation after World War II. Now, it makes sense that there was a reduction in forces that followed, and yet at the same time, there seemed to be an awareness of the threat. In the presidential election of 1948, James Forrestal had made an arrangement with Thomas Dewey, the man running against President Truman, that he would continue on as Secretary of Defense under a Dewey administration. Indeed, many political pundits at the time believed that Dewey was going to defeat Truman, but in fact the opposite occurred. Well, the story, of course, was leaked out by Forrestal's friend Pearson, and Truman asked him to resign immediately. And thus was the end of perhaps the most effective Secretary of Defense that the United States Department of Defense ever had, the subsequent Secretary of Defenses having a very mixed reputation at best. James Forrestal was hospitalized because of the overwork and pressure, at least that's what the official story says, and one of his treatments was to prescribe sedatives. He held himself to a high standard of discipline, and many people say he had burned himself out. And yet the treatment at what is today Walter Reed, an institution that is certainly not short in controversy, especially in its treatment of veterans during the height of the American conflict in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Forrestal is stated to have jumped out of a window and committed suicide, or at least fallen to his death. Forrestal was succeeded by this man, Lewis Johnson, who became Secretary of Defense after Forrestal was asked to resign. Lewis Johnson carried out Truman's directive to continue to reduce the forces of the United States military and not carry out proper funding. This left the United States military in a very poor state of readiness by the start of the 1950s. It should also be noted there was a conflict of interest with Lewis Johnson, as he was a board member of the company that procured and was awarded the contract to develop the B-36 bomber. The B-36 bomber, considered a billion-dollar blunder, as it was a propeller-driven bomber in which the Soviet and Communist forces were armed with the MiG-15, the first jet-powered fighter. Therefore, the B-36, despite all the development costs being spent on it, was already obsolete by the time it rolled off of the tarmac. And indeed, it played virtually no effective role in the Korean War and was quickly retired from service by 1959, having no use. We'll also take a look at the change in the United States military, looking at the overall number of personnel from 1940 going to 400,000, over 12 million at the height of World War II, and then by 1950 reduced to 1.5 million. It should also be noted that many units were totally under-equipped, lacking heavy weapons, tanks, and armor, and this would play a terrifying role on the effectiveness of the U.S. military in responding to the Korean conflict in 1950. And suddenly Truman found that he did not have an effective military to respond to the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. And indeed, this nearly led to total defeat, as not only was the Republic of Korean Army pushed back to the south, but the UN forces, namely the U.S. Army and other supporting elements, were quickly trapped in the Pusan perimeter. There were many units that lacked heavy equipment, tanks, and even effective anti-tank fighting capabilities. It was only after the North Koreans had finally outrun their lines of logistics that the UN forces were able to build up an effective presence in South Korea and counterattack effectively. The United States military paid a heavy price, though, for being completely unprepared, and how many soldiers and service members died who didn't have to die. It's quite a condemnation when we look at what was warned at by James Forrestal, and he seemed to be prescient in a lot of ways. And yet, unfortunately, for his efforts, he died. And yet, very few people actually question what was really going on with James Forrestal, and yet have no questions that there's no historical anomalies with what he was really trying to stand for, even though he was proven right by the subsequent events. What are your thoughts on James Forrestal? From 1945 to 1949, the United States held a nuclear monopoly over all the lands. The United States was the first nation to develop a nuclear weapon, and therefore it had a nuclear monopoly at the end of World War II. Now, what exactly did the United States achieve with its nuclear monopoly? The development of the nuclear weapon was considered one of the end-all be-all goals of all nations in World War II. There was a great fear that the Axis powers were going to develop the atom bomb first, or the Wonder Weapon as it was called. There was much effort devoted, especially by the Germans, to the development of the weapon. However, the United States Manhattan Project and many of its leading scientific figures enabled them to develop and detonate the first test nuclear weapon. As a result of the fact that the United States was the only nation that had the technology of nuclear fission that would eventually be developed into nuclear fusion, the splitting and the amalgamation of the atom. This led to the ability of developing weapons with tremendous explosive yields that were enough to level cities and destroy nations. And certainly the United States was the first nation to be aware of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons. Finally, humanity, in its long quest for destroying itself with weapons of mass destruction, had succeeded in its goal. And certainly since the United States had been the first nation to develop and test these weapons, it had to know better than anybody the destructive potential of nuclear weapons. The situation at the end of World War II was the Axis had been defeated, but now it was the East against the West. Capitalism against communism. The official history tells us that the Soviet Union had a long-standing rivalry with the United States. Indeed, the United States had intervened during the Russian Civil War at the end of World War I. It's often not mentioned that American troops participated in numerous expeditions to the Soviet Union, or Russia at the time, to try to prevent the collapse of the White Russians, or the Russians that supported the imperial family. There are numerous well-documented images of these expeditions that show foreign forces in many major Russian cities. The United States, Great Britain, Japan, even a foreign legion from the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia participated in the area. And here you can see an image of that Czechoslovakian legion. So it seems as though Russia definitely had reason to be xenophobic, as their nation had been invaded by virtually every other allied nation at the end of World War I. So we can understand why Russia, now the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, would fear a nuclear-armed United States. And yet at the same time, one would expect that since the United States was the only nation in the land, in the world, in 1945 that had nuclear weapons, that it would be able to achieve essentially any sort of foreign policy goals that it would want, as there is no nation that could possibly match it. And here we have an image of American troops in Vladivostok. So what exactly happened? We know how everything turned out, that the Soviet Union was able to develop its own atomic bomb in 1949, but that was still 4 years that the United States was the only nuclear-armed nation in the land. So what did the United States do with its nuclear monopoly, as it were? Well, it seems as though it really didn't do much of anything. In fact, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which many debated were unnecessary, as the entry of the Soviet Union into World War II would have forced Japan to surrender anyway, but regardless of whether it was necessary or not, those bombings were supposed to be a demonstration to the Soviet Union of the destructive potential of these weapons. And yet, oddly enough, the Soviet Union seemed to proceed very aggressively with its foreign policy, managing to entrench itself in Eastern Europe and across the lands. And the United States seemed quite powerless to respond, despite the fact that at the end of World War II it had the largest military, and it was also the only armed nuclear power in the world. And yet it was outmaneuvered politically and diplomatically by the Soviet Union in many situations. And we saw how, looking at the James Forrestal story, how that led to the conflict in Korea. And indeed, the United States military was caught in a very unfortunate position of not being prepared for that conflict. At the same time, there was the Berlin blockade. Berlin was divided at the end of World War II, and it stood deep within what would become East Germany. The Soviet Union decided to turn up political pressure, and it cut off the land corridors and logistics of the Western powers supporting their forces and the people of West Berlin. Instead of answering with an escalation of force or even a threat of a nuclear deterrent, the United States simply executed the Berlin airlift in conjunction with the other Western Allied powers at the time, and managed to supply the citizens of West Berlin and their forces accordingly with an airlift. Isn't it interesting, though, that the United States did not simply respond by saying that with the imposition of the Berlin blockade, that they would simply respond with nuclear weapons? The Soviet Union did not possess any nuclear weapons at that time. The United States could have simply bombed Soviet cities until they had capitulated. Now that might seem like that's very ruthless, but yet this was the same president who had authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to begin with. So what exactly had happened to President Truman? Why didn't he approach a more hawkish stance, or at least a nuclear deterrent? Did Harry S. Truman's old mentor, Tom Pendergast, not prepare him for the realities of diplomacy and actual foreign policy? It's rather insane to think of the fact that there was a nuclear-armed nation that was the only nation in the world that was outmaneuvered politically by its greatest rival. And indeed, it seems as though Harry Truman didn't really seem to consider that there was any other alternative. He simply always looked for the least aggressive response. It's almost as though there was something else going on. But what do you think? Why was it the United States was not able to achieve more with its nuclear monopoly? Instead, what we had was a Cold War that lasted for nearly 40 years, with the world at the brink of nuclear annihilation. Certainly, Harry S. Truman had to have been advised by that, and most certainly, there should have been a stronger U.S. response to the attempts of development of an atomic bomb by the Soviet Union. But what are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. What's the real true story? Nuclear war avoided 1949 until now. The prospect of a full-scale nuclear exchange or a nuclear holocaust was a terror that the world faced for 4 or 5 decades, and many would say that we're still facing this horrific existential threat. A terrifying destruction of all the lands by unleashing nuclear weapons, with 2 fully armed nuclear powers facing off at each other, and with the slightest provocation, they could destroy the world, in the length of a lazy afternoon, as Carl Sagan would say. And we had many different specters of nuclear conflict. The possibility that a slight misunderstanding, a commander who misinterpreted something that happened, or even a computer glitch, could unleash the great forces of Armageddon. The power of nuclear weapons is very terrifying. The fact that a single nuclear weapon could completely destroy a city, or even more. Nuclear weapons reached yields of 50 megatons, the Tsar Bomba, the largest one ever tested by the Soviet Union. Most of the nuclear warheads were not quite as large in explosive yield, and yet many were built. We're told that at the height of the Cold War there were over 60,000 nuclear warheads in service. And the whole point of so many nuclear warheads was there was supposed to be a pancaking attack. In other words, they would spread out as many nuclear detonations over the widest surface area that they could. What it would lead to is a total destruction of the land and the unleashing of a nuclear winter. There were also numerous films that we looked at in our live stream Until the End of the World, where we considered the nuclear scare films Threads, The Day After, and there's been many others, including When the Wind Blows. And in all these films, we're told that there is simply no hope to survive a nuclear exchange. Everyone and everything would die. And not only would it die, but it would die very slowly and very terribly. It would be the true situation where the living would envy the dead. It would be a literal hell on earth. Just the very prospect of the mushroom cloud terrified generations for many decades. And yet, despite all the odds indicating that there should have been some sort of nuclear exchange, somehow it was always averted. This terrifying reality, this horrific destiny, was always avoided. And how exactly was that possible? There's been some statisticians who attempted to calculate what the odds were of a nuclear exchange not occurring, given the situation that we were given during the Cold War. 2 fully armed nuclear powers with intercontinental ballistic missiles that land-launched could reach each other's cities within 20 minutes. If they were launched by submarines that were closer, 6 minutes. And we have no shortage of the incredibly terrifying nuclear footage of all the tests, and the very durable cameras that were employed to record these tests, showing these strategic and tactical nuclear weapons detonating. There were also well-documented historical examples, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where World War III, or nuclear war, almost transpired. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the basing of medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba by the Soviet Union. This showed a very terrifying threat that the United States had to respond to. And isn't it intriguing that a lot of this equipment was simply left out to be easily photographed? And it's most certain that the Soviets and the Cubans knew that this equipment could easily be photographed. And yet this led to a very distinct increase in tensions in the Cold War, almost leading to a full-scale preemptive strike by the United States. Fortunately, the president and cooler heads prevailed, and they went with a mere policy of containment, blockading Cuba until all the warheads and delivery systems were removed, which they were. But this wasn't the only situation. There was also the Able Archer exercise in 1983. Able Archer was a full-scale military and political exercise carried out by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to prepare for a nuclear war. The only issue with it was the rehearsal was so realistic that the Soviets believed that NATO was actually preparing for a preemptive strike on Soviet forces, and as a result they increased the alert status of their own nuclear forces accordingly. Very frightening and terrifying display to realize that a mere exercise brought about World War III and a total nuclear exchange. There was also the statement that the KGB knew exactly what NATO was up to at all times, and yet conflicting accounts indicate that they did not, that the Soviet Union very nearly responded to Able Archer 83. There's also the consideration that at any point in time, many unstable commanders on either side of the so-called Iron Curtain could have initiated a nuclear strike on their own recognizance without any oversight. And then there's also the possibility of a computer glitch or some sort of malfunction, whether it's presenting a phantom attack on a computer screen or it's simply a pre-programmed attack in the event of a fail-safe being triggered. Whatever the case, for whatever reason, we somehow managed to avoid nuclear exchange until today, and we continue to avoid it every single day that we continue to go on. But what's the real reason for it? What are your thoughts? How exactly was a full-scale nuclear conflict avoided for the decades of the Cold War, and even until now? One of the most stunning achievements that we have revealed in history is the ability of the United States Navy to construct so many ships in a short period of time. We've considered other tremendous logistical achievements in other explorations, but we haven't looked at this particular achievement. Keep in mind that when the United States Navy embarked upon this shipbuilding program, this was at the start of World War II. And yet when we look at the U.S. Navy active ship force levels from the History of the Navy military website itself, we can see that from 1938, the total active ships in the United States Navy went from 380 to simply 6 years later being 6,084. And really the most dramatic increases being from 1941 to 1944. In a 3-year period of time, this force increased well over 7-fold. An unbelievable increase in the number of ships. How are so many ships built in such a short period of time? It seems as though the United States' unlimited industrial capacity was brought to bear, that they were able to rapidly train a new entire workforce, as many of the trained individuals had gone off to join the military. Although we know that in World War II, it being a strategic war, the organization of the use of labor was completely different. Yet isn't it fascinating that this was achieved by a nation from 1941 to 1944 that just a few years earlier couldn't even feed its own people or provide employment and was in a total depression? Isn't it quite a stark contrast? Now, we're not questioning that. It's just quite an amazing consideration when you think about it, that just a few short years earlier, the entire nation was in a Great Depression. And then because of the advent of war, it quickly switched to a war economy and was able to build many of these ships. Indeed, look at the fleet carriers. These are the largest capital ships in the United States Navy. And from 1942, granted, there were losses that were occurring as the United States entry into World War II started with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Although fortuitously none of the carriers were caught in Pearl Harbor, it merely involved battleships. We can see how quickly the fleet carrier strength increased from 7 to 25 in 3 years. And that was with combat losses as well to the Imperial Japanese Navy. We also look at the escort carriers going from 1 in 1941 to 65 in 1944. Now keep in mind, these are just actual combat ships or support ships for the U.S. Navy. We're not talking about all the cargo ships or the Liberty ships that the United States managed to build. The total amount of ships is staggering. But we do have some images of what post-World War II looked like when many of these ships were put in the mothball. And here we can see several escort carriers numerous other support ships, so many ships filling the entire port. It's a staggering and tremendous achievement that the United States was able to achieve this kind of shipbuilding output in just a few short years. And yet we have other images that show this. Just unbelievable in terms of how many ships they were able to build in such a short amount of time. And we can see many other images of these mothballed fleets, which include all types of ships, whether it's carriers, cruisers, destroyers. Even in this image here, we can see a little bit of everything. We have what looks to be an escort carrier. We have some light cruisers, other escort carriers. Just an impressive amount of ships. Consider all the materials that went into this. Consider training the labor force to be able to rapidly construct all these ships. And then not to mention, even the impressive expansion of the United States Navy to rapidly train and crew all of these ships. And then at the same time, to recall what happened with the complete disarmament of the United States military at the end of World War II to find itself unprepared to conduct the war in Korea initially. So, what's your take on this entire situation? Was this just something that merely involved tremendous organization, and the United States was able to achieve this? I mean, we know the United States achieved this. It is indeed very well documented, and it's very well documented that the United States seemed to disarm itself as fast as it could and did not take advantage of its nuclear monopoly and found itself in a grave disadvantage in the Korean conflict. But what are the real explanations for all these outcomes? And what are your thoughts on this sort of exploration, looking at some rather strange events that really did occur in history? Well, thank you for joining me. The 1800s, a century with lots of development and technological innovations along with conflict and vast social changes. We have so many clues from this particular century. Today we're going to explore the strange events of the 1800s.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
So the first event we'll look at is the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. At least that's what the official history tells us. The Napoleonic Wars are interesting because we start the century off with a vast series of conflicts, primarily centered in Europe, although it should be noted that these conflicts occurred across the land and the sea. Indeed, if you ever watched Master and Commander, that ship battle was set around South America. We see many different depictions, though, of Napoleon, and in the past, the channel explored the concept of Napoleon being some sort of reset commander who decided to go against the grain and try to establish himself as a leading authority figure. There are many oddities about this conflict, though, including the ability to defy logistical limitations. Now, what's interesting about the Napoleonic Wars is they occurred after the initial start of what we're told is the Industrial Revolution. It was also the first attempt at nations to engage in mass mobilization or conscripting very large armies. And these armies they were somehow able to sustain because we're told that the Industrial Revolution had improved agricultural capacity. Napoleon was a bit of a maverick character, and the official history says that, and I suspect that what the true account is, if Napoleon did exist, is that he's a bit of a maverick character as well. Yet in the recent movie that we saw, Napoleon looked anything but interested in whatever he was doing, and of course that's just the creative choices of the movie, which I found rather interesting. And we certainly know that Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor, but when you contrast that with some of the images that we have in Napoleon, we certainly see a vast difference. We're led to believe by the official historical account that Napoleon was a very charismatic figure, and he was very engaging, and he was also a military genius. And yet in the film, we find out that the love of his life, Josephina, was his main concern, although it should be noted that when she was seducing him, he looked like he couldn't be even more disinterested. But again, creative choices in the movie. Yet in many of these other images that we see of him, he is this very inspiring commander, and he managed to unify France during a time of vast social change and revolution. Of course, it led to a very bloody conflict, and for whatever reason, the most interesting thing about the Napoleonic Wars is once the conflict ended, Napoleon was not imprisoned, he was not executed for starting wars that killed millions of people. He was simply sent away initially to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, where he was allowed to live in comfort. He escaped from the island and started another war, and was defeated yet again. And so he was exiled, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, the southern Atlantic, in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Yet, of course, they still gave him a nice mansion to live out his days in. Now imagine if the guy from World War II with the mustache had ended up like that. Imagine if they'd given him some nice retirement villa after World War II in some South American nation. I wonder how well that would have been received. Many questions, though, about the Napoleonic conflict and many conflicting accounts, and I'm not here to lampoon the movie. I've done that in other explorations. I just find the creative decisions interesting, and we know that everyone who was involved with the film was very creatively inspired and there were great performers. It should be noted that we do have some images of soldiers dressing up in uniforms from that particular time frame, although what the authenticity of these actual photos are is left to the imagination. I'd imagine a uniform like that would get a little warm, especially in the summer days going across Europe, but you never know. I mean, at least you look really cool and you've got many different aspects to your uniform. So that's the Napoleonic Wars. Let's go to the year without a summer, 1816. The year without a summer, the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, which caused the entire area and sky of the land to be blanketed with ash, and as a result it reduced the sunlight reaching the land and caused a vast drop in temperatures, and as the title implies, it was the year without the summer. Is that really what transpired, though? And here we have the comparison of different volcanoes, and Mount Tambora is one of the biggest in recorded human history in terms of cubic miles of ejecta. Nice word there, ejecta. And what we're told is that this eruption caused an entire layer of volcanic ash to stop the sun from penetrating, and it greatly disrupted the seasons. Oddly enough, though, when you try to corroborate this with local accounts and news and history at the time, it's a little bit of a conflicting account because it seems to affect some areas more than others, and certainly we can make that conclusion that that's always the case when we have an event such as this. There's different aspects of artwork, and it should even be noted that this year without a summer even influenced Mary Shelley to tell her little story about Frankenstein, which endures to this day. What really transpired, though, with this year without a summer? Is this exactly what happened and why? Or was this because of other causes and other events? Is this because this eruption was actually something else that happened that changed the nature of the landscape? Indeed, one of the recurring challenges that we have, according to the official history in the 1800s, is the vast changes in weather. Although what's interesting is that we're told that there was a little bit of a cold period that supposedly ended in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and yet you'll find later that we have a recurrence of cold periods throughout the entire century, from 1800 to 1899. We have many paintings that show us that there were great hardships as a result of this year without a summer. We're told that there were many lives lost because of famines due to the crop losses. We're also told that there were other complications. And yet, oddly enough, as I said earlier, when you try to actually compare and contrast many of these accounts that were contemporaneous from this time frame, they're very conflicting. It seems as though this disaster was felt in some areas more than others, and as I've said, there's nothing odd about that. That's entirely possible. But where the oddities come into play is some of the observations that you have of what was really occurring at that time. Changes of observations in the sky, changes of actual crop yields, and the true effect of this year without a summer. One thing that's interesting is you would think that this would have a great crippling effect on the nascent United States as a nation, as the United States had just come out of the War of 1812 and was still a relatively new nation. And yet, it does not appear to have been negatively affected by this year without a summer. What do you think this event was, and what was really going on, and why do we have so many conflicting accounts? And now we go to the New Madrid earthquake in 1811, the greatest earthquake recorded in North America, and oddly enough, near Missouri, New Madrid, Missouri specifically, and yet we're told that very few people died. A very horrific earthquake that is even reputed to have caused the mighty Mississippi to flow backwards. Now again, this is another questionable event. What exactly was going on? Was this just a random earthquake? And of course, as you can see, we have all of the plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and we shouldn't question the plaques because nobody would actually put the money to put up things that aren't true or didn't really happen. And there's no doubt that something happened, and we're told that it was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, and the effects were felt everywhere. Yet, oddly enough, no loss of life, but vast damage of many structures. And don't you find that interesting? So, if there weren't a lot of people living there, then what structures were actually damaged? Well, again, just don't think about it too much. We have a historical account, and we know that it was a very terrible earthquake. And even though we have plenty of first-hand accounts of the Mississippi flowing backwards and many other odd observations from the time frame, what do you think the New Madrid earthquake actually represented and what was going on? The New Madrid fault line, which we're told is still active, although it hasn't really been active since this earthquake in 1811. And certainly if there were any tremors or earthquakes that have occurred, we'd hear about it. The revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 revolved around social change, ostensibly centered in Europe, although it seems as though it occurred across the land. And what we're told is that the people had grown tired of being under the rule of monarchs and other difficult situations and the authoritarian rules that they employed in Europe at that time. And therefore, many of the people in the working classes decided to rise up and rebel against their monarch governments and many of the other authoritarian regimes that were going on at the time. Now, the official history tells us that this period of uprising was very bloody, and officially what had happened was that the revolutions were put down by the monarch governments at the time. Although on a longer timeline, what ended up happening was certain individuals such as Otto von Bismarck and what would become the nation of Germany, they did give concessions to the desire of the citizenry to actually have more rights. At least that's what we're told. And it's a very odd account. What was really going on? Was this really a grassroots social revolution that occurred in 1848? Or was this something else? Because it's interesting to note just how many years in the 1800s were actually filled with conflict. External conflict, internal conflict. And yet, oddly enough, none of these nations ever seem to have any issue with mobilizing their vast military resources or even logistically sustaining them, whether they were on expeditionary campaigns across far seas or whether they were fighting their own citizens in an internal conflict or a quote-unquote civil war, which we've talked about quite extensively on the channel. But what did these social revolutions really point to? And did these leaders really actually represent the desires of the people, or were they simply giving the people what their desires were? The revolutions were put down, but since they were called revolutions over a long enough timeline, they were considered successful. So even in the historicity of these social revolutions of 1848, we have a conflicting account. The governments prevailed and put down the armed insurrection, as it were, but the desires and the aims of the people to actually achieve a greater set of freedoms, or let's be honest, it was actually liberties that they were looking for, because when you operate in a society, you only have liberty, you don't actually have freedom. And they had achieved some of the liberties that they were looking for. Although this didn't stop many people from emigrating to the United States from many of these nations where they felt oppression, and there were other issues that were going on. We can refer to many isolated instances of people that simply didn't have enough to sustain themselves, such as the potato famine in Ireland, and there's many other examples. The artwork from this period reflects a very brutal conflict, and we see a lot of siege battles, and we see many great assaults that gives us the impression that this was a much more brutal conflict. It's also intriguing to note some of the wondrous architecture that we have that was already available in the 1800s. It's yet another one of these major events from the 1800s that causes us to question what was really going on. The 1800s population bomb, namely in the United States. We look at how fast the population growth occurred in the United States, and we have a separate exploration on that. But across the entire lands, we're told the population didn't really grow that much. And yet, once again, you have conflicting accounts. And as we ascertain, the population of the United States itself grew over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And then we have certain United States cities where the population grew 200,000% in a 100-year period, such as Seattle from 1860 to 1960. So again, what was really going on? We have many accounts, especially in the United States, of vast population growth. It just feels like you're on a ride and they're constantly revising things. The orphan trains, 1850, well, did they ever really stop? That's certainly debatable. The odd thing about the orphan trains, which we've explored extensively on the channel, is it seems to be a redistribution of population, or as we speculated when we did the initial explorations, it seemed to be a diaspora of children. moving them out and spreading them out from where their original homeland actually was. Now, we're told that there were very benevolent and altruistic reasons for doing this. We had children who were stuck in the cities, although it just really seemed to apply to New York City and not all the cities on the United States eastern seaboard. There were also accounts of the orphan trains occurring in other nations across the land. And while the initial impression is that this only applied to one particular social group or nationality of children, it actually applied to all groups of children, if you do a little bit more looking and investigating in terms of what actually happened. But we have children that were spread out all across the land in many different locations, and the reason I put the question mark in terms of not knowing when this ended is who's to say that this really ended, as we still have orphans from current conflicts who get spread out to different lands. Now, it may be true that this is for an altruistic purpose, and we're legitimately trying to help these children. You can find no shortage of public broadcasting specials where they have veterans of the orphan trains who are interviewed, and they talk about how wonderful their experience was and the family that adopted them treated them very well. And I have no doubt that that's the case, but it's just odd that we have this very positive image of children that were, in many cases, taken from their families, their rightful families, as there's many cases of the one parent that was still alive in the 1800s, and the children were taken away from them and then sent around to other areas in the country. Was there something much more insidious going on? And the orphan trains is another one of those great examples from the 1800s that there seemed to be a lot more going on than what the official history tells us. One of the real purposes of this exploration, though, is I'm looking to detail some of the evidence that we have in the mainstream account that enables us to construct our theories in terms of what really happened. Now, at the end of this exploration, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say exactly what the mainstream tells us in terms of doing this, because only two types of people are allowed to really ascertain what's actually going on in the land, and those people are scientists and historians. They're the only ones who can tell you if you're in a conspiracy, and you may get spun around and thrown around and you're not really sure what's going on. Victoria to the USA, 1800 to 1900. In the 1800s, we had what was called the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it were at the time, and that was the time when they said that the sun didn't set on the British Empire. And indeed, the British Army was second to none in the world, at least according to the official history, and they had a lot of ability to project military capacity across the land. Although the situation in Great Britain after the Industrial Revolution is conflicted. We have numerous accounts of child labor and very difficult labor conditions, and that was part of what led to some of the social revolutions that we talked about in 1848. We also have a very conflicted account of society. We have a great group of haves and have-nots, and this actually reached its culmination point in some of the writings of H.G. Wells when he posited that the class division would lead to separate evolutionary paths on humanity. Ah, yes, evolution. That's always a good one to consider. Where they ended up in his novel The Time Machine, the workers becoming the Morlocks, or creatures that lived underground for hundreds of thousands of years, and the Eloi, or the descendants of the people that lived the Victorian lifestyle of being the higher class. Of course, people say that H.G. Wells didn't know that the middle class would develop. Queen Victoria is an interesting character, as most individuals of monarchy are, and we're told that she actually reached her Diamond Jubilee, one of the few monarchs to do so. We also have many other accounts of what life was actually like during that time frame, and while you have the great Victorian parties and many well-dressed people, you also have these accounts of very unfortunate labor conditions and slums that are all over the place. Yet, oddly enough, during the same time frame, you also have accounts of housing being constructed across Great Britain and in Scotland, where many of these tenements managed to endure to this day. The challenge was, though, in the 1960s, when they began new urban development programs in places such as Scotland, they didn't exactly know what they're doing, at least that's what the official history says, and so they ended up displacing many people and putting them into large tower residences that didn't exactly work out so well. There's a little film from the late 90s called Ratcatcher, which depicts this quite well, and naturally it stars Tommy Flanagan. And then the Victorian time frame and the British were supplanted by the United States, the nascent nation of the United States, which became a world power, and the event which official history tells us that prompted that was the Spanish-American War, and we just looked at the wreckage of the USS Maine, which was sunk in Cuba by supposedly the Spanish, because Cuba was a Spanish possession at that time. And the United States got drawn into the conflict, or rather incited the conflict, depending on your view of history. and the United States engaged in what they called a splendid little war against Spain, and as a result, Cuba was liberated from Spain and became its own nation, and the United States acquired numerous colonial possessions, even though the United States was not supposed to be a nation that was interested in acquiring colonial possessions, namely the Philippines, which would go on to play a very significant role during World War II. It's very odd, though, to consider how the United States in just 100 short years had gone from being a nascent backwater nation to becoming a world power. And many historians agree that the Spanish-American War was when the United States had become a world power. Suddenly, it had managed to master the aspects of the expeditionary military approach, it built a navy overnight, and it also began to employ a national army. To what we have today, where the United States is the only military that actually divides up all the known lands into geographical areas of responsibility called combatant commands. And it seems that without a doubt that this transition of power, or at least the overt exercising of military power, was complete at the end of World War II, where the United States would be the primary practitioner of military campaigns across the land. Many of the battles from the Spanish-American War are very interesting to consider, whether you're looking at the battles that occurred in Cuba or in the Philippines. It's an odd comparison of naval actions with land actions, and whether you're looking at the exploits of Admiral Dewey or Teddy Roosevelt himself, you have this odd theme with the United States military where it seems that adventurers are always very successful. And yet you compare and contrast that with some of the earlier failed American military adventures, especially in the War of 1812. And here we have Teddy Roosevelt himself giving a very rousing speech to one of the oddities that occurred after the Spanish-American War, the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was supposed to be a showcase of the new American military power, at least in the Navy, and we're told that Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and whose face adorns Mount Rushmore to this day, was a proponent of utilizing naval power. And indeed, naval power was considered one of the most threatening aspects to world peace, as there was the Washington Naval Treaty. Again, this is all the official history. Although isn't it odd that many of these treaties merely serve to encourage, or at least we're told encourage, more innovative approaches to military problems. Perhaps the most interesting aspect, though, in the change of power from the United Kingdom or Great Britain to the United States is just how seamlessly it seemed to happen. And you can really look closely at the development from the Spanish-American War in 1898 to the end of World War II in 1945, and really look at the official strength of the Navy and the military, and then also in what geographical areas both the nations were applied in. It went from the sun never sets on the British Empire to the sun never sets on the presence of the United States military. And whether it's a base or the vast naval presence of the United States military, that all seemed to have its incipience in the use of the Great White Fleet. And here you can see these were the ports of call, and isn't it odd that there weren't many ports of call in Europe at that time? Because you would think they would want to show off the Great White Fleet to nations such as the United Kingdom and Germany. And of course, we have no shortage of our great plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and the interesting historiosity of the Great White Fleet, and where it was applied and where it wasn't applied. There's no shortage, though, of documentation and photographs and articles and plaques written about the Great White Fleet. It's quite intriguing. It's intriguing to think that the Great White Fleet occurred right after the World's Fairs. And now we look at technology. The technological developments of the 1800s are very intriguing. From photographs to telephone to the car, electric telegraph, the vast railway networks, especially in the United States, that the United States managed to apply more rail networks than any other nation, and x-rays, underground railroads, sewing machines, rubber tires, and of course, the public flushing toilet. So you see right there all these technological innovations in the 1800s which brought about modern life. Now, of course, we have some other looks at history that suggest that perhaps there were more technological innovations. Now, there's no official documentation of a television from the 1800s, but it should be noted that there are a lot of rumors of it. State capitals, 1800 to 1899. And we've done many explorations of state capitals, and I always find it interesting that nearly half the states in the United States still have their original state capitals from the 1800s. And they're very gorgeous and impressive buildings, and they're standing quite well to this day. And there seems to be no issue with the maintenance of these buildings, although we'll have conflicting accounts in terms of how well constructed they were. Apparently, there was no issue with building a beautiful state capitol in Denver, Colorado in the mountains in the 1800s, and it still stands to this day. We've looked at the Capitol in Connecticut, another one of the most beautiful ones, and in my humble opinion, it compares very closely with what we consider as building number one in our explorations here on this channel. But when you look across at all these different state capitals and you see the similar designs, it's intriguing to think that all these state capitals were built at the same time as many of the county courthouses across the land, with very intricate construction and great details, such as the state capitol here in Springfield, Illinois. And was Springfield the home of the Simpsons? I don't know. They made several allusions to it. We'll have an upcoming exploration on that one. There's state capitals everywhere, though, that give you the impression of great portal windows, wondrous domes, and very interesting construction material. When you go to assess it, you'll be told it's a combination of sandstone, limestone, and of course, I couldn't resist throwing in building number one, the Iowa State Capitol. Even its construction material is quite intriguing, and when you view it on the inside, you definitely get the feeling that you're not in any sort of state capitol, but you're in a palace. And wherever you look at these state capitals, you'll see the similar construction stylings, the pediment, the dome, the great columns, the pillars that are built in the wall, and then of course they're always on hills. And wherever you are in the land, you'll find that there's never any shortage of the construction capabilities. There are certain aspects that match, and yet there are many nuances that show off in many of these wondrous state capitals. And keep in mind, we're looking at only the state capitals that were specifically constructed in the 1800s. We have a couple beauties that were supposedly constructed in the 1700s, and then we have quite a few in the early 1900s. And yet they all seem to be constructed from the same time frame when you compare some of them. And it's very odd that the ability to lay out these wondrous state capitals seemed to end for good around the 1930s, although really you could say it was around the 1920s. New York State Capitol is always very interesting, as you would expect to see a traditional dome, and we don't have that. We have what looks to be a wonderful mansion, or maybe another home for the Vanderbilts. I'm just saying it looks that way, I'm not suggesting that. And yet, wherever you are in the land, you can always find that these state capitals from the 1800s are going to endure for all time, and they give great inspiration in terms of their construction capabilities, whether they have a dome on top or not, or a pediment, or they're slightly different styles. There are different styles when it comes to the 1800s, and yet so many things that seem to be the same. It's a complex situation of similar architecture, and yet we're supposed to believe that all this occurred in the 1800s, along with all the great courthouses. And let's not forget the wondrous state capitol in Austin, Texas, something that quite frankly exceeds the capital of the United States, not just in terms of its space, but its location, its overall beauty. And wherever you look, whether you're in the smaller states of Vermont or New Hampshire, you'll see that the same stylings of the state capitol are not lost. And even in Wyoming, when they just had cowboys and settlers and prospectors, they were still able to design and erect a very impressive state capitol. And I'm sure there's no shortage of talented architects to be found. The World's Fairs from 1851 through 1900. The World's Fairs are one of the interesting elements of exploration that we do when it comes to this alternative research, because these represent the fact that something strange was going on in the 1800s. Yes, the telescope from the Chicago World's Fair, which to this day you can still go and see in an observatory off Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, where it ended up. We have many wonderful showcasings of buildings from these World's Fairs and odd enough exhibitions of great technology, because even though this was nascent technology, it seems as though the people managed to adapt very quickly. The beautiful Crystal Palace, the mobile Crystal Palace from the original World's Fair. Yes, quite intriguing that they managed to produce all this glass in a record amount of time, and then they managed to move it because building it wasn't good enough. Gotta give Great Britain credit, though. All their wondrous old world infrastructure, it's mobile. But unfortunately, the Crystal Palace is no longer with us, as it caught fire in the 1930s, and we'll be doing an exploration where we're going to look a lot more closely at this particular Crystal Palace. How exactly does a structure such as this catch on fire? Well, just don't ask, okay? We just know it happens. And here you can see the unfortunate devastated remnants of the Crystal Palace, although it looks like the tower came off pretty nicely. I wonder why they tore down the tower. Well, because the main structure was gone. The gold rushes of 1849, 1896, gold rushes to California, gold rushes to Alaska, the Klondike, the Yukon, all the unique areas that seem to draw vast amounts of people. I wonder why we don't have gold rushes to this day. Oh, that's right, we don't need to have gold rushes. We have cryptocurrency rushes, and you can just do those from the comfort of your own computer. You don't need to get on a really uncomfortable boat and go to some unfortunate area that has no development whatsoever and no logistical capacity and decide to go prospecting for gold. And indeed, the official history tells us that no one came up successful when they were looking for gold. But we do have these interesting photos that show this vast arrival of ships in ports such as San Francisco. Now, let's just think about this. Is this exactly what's really happening? Are we really looking at all these prospectors who filled up San Francisco Bay in a very short amount of time? Or was something else being depicted here? A vast arrival of many people from some other area for another reason. And Gold Rush just happened to be a nice little way to explain it. Because even if you had a gold rush, don't you think people would be thinking about the fact that, I'm going to go to an area that is unsettled, uncivilized from my perspective, and look for gold? I mean, granted, Al Bundy did it in the 1980s, and it wasn't too successful, and it turned out that he was merely prospecting for fool's gold. Now let's look at blizzards and freezes of the 1800s, and we talked about earlier how the climate, the environment seemed to change a lot through the 1800s. Officially, we're told that things improved and warmed up through the 1800s, but then we have conflicting accounts of vast blizzards and great freezes, and it wasn't just the year without the summer in 1816. We even have one as late as 1899, where we have vast amounts of snow and very unseasonable cold temperatures that buried many of the cities in the Northeast and even brought strife to the cities in the southern United States, all the way down to Florida, where they were certainly not used to snowfall. And indeed, the first image we looked at was snowfall in Florida. Many feet of snow fell, and it wasn't confined to the mountain resorts of Nevada or Lake Tahoe to this day, but they were all over the place. And why is it we have these recurring themes of vast amounts of snowfall? Did this reflect something else? Now, I know I haven't included the Carrington event in this particular series of explorations, and by all means did I not say that this exploration was comprehensive of all the strange events of the 1800s. Let's be honest, there were thousands. But we'll be looking at the Carrington event in a separate exploration because it is quite interesting, and we're told officially it didn't have many historical impacts, and yet other indications show that it did. Back to the weather, though, we can see how the weather affected, at least we're told, the United States especially. And yet again, despite all these great challenges, the loss of many oranges in Florida because of the weather issues, somehow the nation seemed to survive and continue to progress. And indeed, this was at the time when the United States became a world power, because this last blizzard in 1899 certainly didn't stop any of the great advances that the nation was making, and it did not impede its ability to take its stage with the world, especially when it came to World War I, where the introduction of American troops towards the end, we're told, was decisive to bringing about the Allies' final victory. So you have it, many great conflicting events from the 1800s, many strange events that give cause to question exactly what was going on and why. Many people have looked at the 1800s before, and it's a very odd time frame. And indeed, if a time frame that is so recent, at least in the grand scheme of the overall passage of time, has so many questions about it, then we really have to consider, where else do we have questions? What was real and what wasn't real? What happened and what didn't happen? Now, of course, if we consult the mainstream, they have answers for this, and they're going to tell us that we should not be thinking independently about this. And how exactly would the mainstream respond to these separate investigations, these explorations? Well, I think we should consider that to close this particular exploration. How does the mainstream respond to what we do with our alternative exploration? Well, this article might provide some insight. 1800s technology conspiracies behind the era of invention. And here we have the image of the individual in the 1800s looking at a television. Very fascinating. But we're told that it's known as the Age of Progress, the 1800s, the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm surprised we don't have 8 industrial revolutions, to be honest with you. However, a growing trend of conspiracy theories surrounding these inventions prompts intriguing discussions. So they do admit that this is intriguing and compelling. And they talk about the invention of the light bulb, and then they talk about the debate between Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison. But then they say that Maxim himself, who said he invented the light bulb, was a controversial figure, because Thomas Edison is most certainly not a controversial figure. And by the way, remember, he did invent a version of Portland cement that was very, very useful in constructing certain stadiums, and we explored that in the past. Tesla's wireless electricity suppressed technology. And of course, they detail the efforts of Nikola Tesla to provide wireless technology, but then they say that there were many great obstacles to this wireless technology. Of course, there were no practical obstacles to all the other developments in the 1800s, such as the telegraph or the rapid construction of railroads, where none had existed. And when you can move 11,000 miles of track in 36 hours and change the gauge on it, why would there be any practical obstacles? Certainly not. The telephone patent race, and then finally our conclusion, decoding the conspiracy. While these 19th century technology conspiracy theories are captivating, they often reflect our own insecurities about technological control and credit more than they reveal about historical fact. Ah, yes, it's your own insecurities when you question things. That's why. The development of technology is rarely a linear path traced to a single individual. Rather, it's a collective endeavor. Oh, except when it comes to Edison, then it's a single individual, but I digress. By scrutinizing these conspiracies, we can better understand the complex social dynamics that shape technological progress. Yet it's crucial to separate sensational speculation, and you might notice that speculation and well-documented are two of the buzz terms we hear a lot, from nuanced historical understanding to truly appreciate the fascinating history of 1800s technological innovations. So in other words, things are only impossible until they're not, just like Captain Picard said. Well, let's take a look because we have history and science and the two tend to run together. One of the responses that I received in a reply on the 1980s exploration is one of the elements that showed how far we've come in technological progress since 1980 when Carl Sagan did Cosmos was the detection of exoplanets. Carl Sagan had teased it in Cosmos in the 1980s, and I just thought we would look at how science tells us they actually detect exoplanets. Because are we actually able to see planets in other solar systems that are 25 trillion miles away? And by the way, that's the nearest solar system. And again, that's what science tells us. And what are the techniques that they use? Well, they have the wobbling star that hints at an exoplanet presence. The first planets found orbiting sun-like stars are detected by radial velocity technique. A single star devoid of a planetary system will have its center of gravity located at the center of the star. However, when a planet orbits a star, the center of gravity of the star-planet system becomes offset from the center of the star, causing the star to wobble. That's right. If you see a wobbly star, then it may have planets around it. Now, of course, we don't actually see these planets directly, but we can see a little bit of a wobble in a star. That's 25 trillion miles, and that's the nearest one, or many, many more, because 25 trillion miles is about 4.3 light years. Again, going off what the science tells us. There must be more techniques to detect exoplanets. Astrometry is the method that detects the motion of a star by making precise measurements of its position in the sky. Again, 25 trillion miles or more. This technique can be used to identify planets around a star by measuring tiny changes in the star's position as it wobbles around the center of mass of the planetary system. So again, we don't actually see the planets. We see how the star or the light is affected. And from that, scientists are able to ascertain that there are planets around the star. Because there's no other subspace anomalies out there or random other reasons for why there might be variances in the starlight or these wobbly effects that we have. Look, this is science. They are telling us the truth, and it's very clear that this is not speculation when they show us these images of these planets. Even though they don't actually see the planets, they see the changes in the light from the stars, what we're told. And it should be noted that this is the difference between rampant speculation, which is what we're doing when we actually question what we're told, as opposed to good science and good history. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. The United States of America, the great state. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. We're going to explore the origins of the United States, the world's hyperpower. How did this colonial breakaway from the British Empire become the hyperpower that it is today? Come join me as we explore the American Republic.
This isn't an ordinary fight.
This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
We've extensively explored the United States in our explorations, and we're going to examine this rail map from 1875 when it was composed, and it was originally composed to celebrate the centennial of the United States. And you might be surprised to know that the United States was already completely divided out by 1875 when this map was made, and it includes the United States and the Dominion of Canada at the time. And we can see that it includes the wondrous infrastructure that had to be completed to support the railroad. Everywhere at the same time, the United States was rapidly constructed, and here we see an image of the differing United States Capitol domes, supposedly. It's also intriguing to realize that the geographical definitions of all the states seem to have been defined, and we had many centennials and World's Fairs that had already transpired at this time, according to the official history. We can see that the fine geographical definitions of the states were already established. It's almost as though there was some sort of preconceived plan, and indeed the only states not divided in this map are the Dakotas into North and South Dakota, but everything else is as we know it now. We looked at certain states, such as Georgia, and we consider the early history of Georgia, namely the capital of Atlanta. Atlanta did not exist, really, prior to 1800 at all. It was a rail stop that was suddenly built up, destroyed in the Civil War by the Union Army, and then quickly rebuilt after the Civil War. It's an all too common story that we have. And indeed, most of the cities that we've explored in the United States didn't even exist before 1800, or they were simple settlements or forts, such as Nashville in Tennessee, another city that grew rapidly in the 1800s. And we've explored elsewhere across the eastern United States, such as Louisville, where we've seen wondrous architecture, and again, another city that rapidly developed and grew in the 1800s. And I don't want to forget to mention Cincinnati, one of my favorite explorations, where we saw a city that we're told was made by Germans, and Indianapolis in Indiana, a city that seems to be a terminus point. And of course, who can forget Chicago, where they had the Great World's Fair and several fires. So many cities that developed in the 1800s, to include Milwaukee with this wondrous courthouse and the large convent, visible from the river very easily. And going over to Minnesota and Minneapolis and St. Paul, two cities that grew very quickly. And indeed, many of these cities grew rapidly. We have courthouses, and we have Rochester in Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic developed, and this wondrous courthouse in Austin, Minnesota. Of course, we see the brutalist example that remains to this day. And looking across this map, we can see that all these structures were completed at the same time. State capitals, county courthouses, infrastructure, railways, all done within the 1800s. Our favorite Iowa State Capitol, or at least my favorite, maybe you don't like it, and that's entirely okay. And yet, the presence of Iowa State College at Ames, and yet Ames, Iowa is not depicted on this map, even though it was originally constructed as a rail stop. Very interesting. We go out to Nebraska on the Transcontinental Railroad, and we can see the many communities that were along it, and maybe even see Gene Hackman when he thought he was dead, but he was actually just in Nebraska. I don't have anything against Nebraska. We can see, though, that the Dakotas have no infrastructure depicted in them, no railroads, and yet they rapidly grew. Recall our exploration of Mount Rushmore and Devil's Tower, and seeing the top of Devil's Tower in what is today Wyoming. And even back when this map was constructed, it was very clearly Wyoming. So many interesting things and wondrous achievements in a short 100-year period. And over here on this map, we even have some population figures and railway distribution in terms of how much mileage in each state. It's a very impressive set of achievements that's all illustrated on one map. Remember that the United States was a breakaway colonial possession of the British Empire. There was no reason for this wondrous experiment, at least we're told it was an experiment in government, to suddenly succeed. And not only did it succeed, it rapidly grew in under 100 years. All this infrastructure, all these bridges, all these railroads, all these state capitals, even the U.S. state capitol, the courthouses, and let's not forget the population. And you can certainly go back and look at the population video to see how unprecedented the growth of population in the United States is. Many will try to explain it by simply saying it was because of immigration. We also have our early governors, and some very interesting early governors, such as C.C. Carpenter, the governor of Iowa, in the 1870s. Isn't it intriguing that they wanted to make sure everybody knew who the governor was and what their term was, even during this time frame? And who is the individual who made this map? Gaylord Watson? Did Gaylord Watson appear like Ben Stiller? Because we don't have an image of Gaylord Watson, which I find quite fascinating, and yet this was an official map that was logged in the Library of Congress. So what to make of this impressive map that shows us the incredible achievements of the American Republic in under 100 years? It's very impressive if it's taken at face value. But is this really to be taken at face value? Let's examine what the United States has become. And we went from a backwater colony to the world power, and that's depicted here in the Unified Combatant Command's area of responsibility, where the United States Department of Defense has divided up every geographical area in the known land, the world, the realm, whatever you want to call it, into geographical areas of responsibility, even violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that military cannot be used in a law enforcement role, but we're told that U.S. Northern Command was a practical necessity due to matters of national security, and therefore it exists. So regardless of concerns in earlier American times, they have Northern Command. They have a command that encompasses every single geographical area. And the intention behind this is so that there can be a division and a unified chain of command for the employment of American military forces anywhere in the land. Indeed, the United States is the only military in the world that divides up the entire world into geographical areas of responsibility. It's also the only military in the world, as far as we know, that has what's called expeditionary capability, the ability to deploy military forces to any point in the land. They even have a space command area. Now, whatever your opinion on this is quite an amazing change from what was just a group of colonies that was considered a backwater area. And there's even a book that's been written called Flight of the Eagle by this particular individual, Conrad Black, Lord Black, who is considered somewhat controversial himself. But whatever your opinion on the individual, this is the only novel or book that considers the strategy from America's rise. And we look at the founding fathers of the United States, the founding fathers which seem to have even come to a mythical status. And officially we're told the founding fathers were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the composers of the Constitution, although we specify things a little bit more. We have George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and a few others. Oh, I don't want to forget Alexander Hamilton. But these were the individuals who had these wondrous thoughts of creating a republic, a democracy. Even though things started to change, if we look at the 5 pillars of the original American Republic, we have faith in God, respect for the Bible, sinfulness of human nature, Christian virtue necessary, and government exists to protect faith and freedom. That's very different than the other aspects or perceptions that we have of the modern American state, where we say we believe in the separation of church and state. But of course, we understand that things were very different. People thought and operated very differently at that time. At least that's what we're told. Regardless, though, we have this conflicting account with the nascency of the United States. We also have many of these mythological images and these symbols that are so powerful. Lady Columbia, the Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam. And yet when you look at a lot of the artwork that we've seen in many of these wonderful structures that were constructed in the United States, we see many mythical impersonations and even what would be considered folk art, such as this image where we see people paying their taxes. And I thought it was very fitting since it's April in the United States, and everyone in the United States knows what April means, unless of course you file for an extension. The symbolism is very interesting though with Lady Columbia and the aspects of innate wisdom. It almost reflects something that we could consider from the Greco-Roman pantheon of deities. Why do we see this so present in the United States? And indeed, in all the state capital explorations that we've done, we've seen some sort of reference to this symbolism, not symbology, but symbolism. And we've even seen it in many county courthouses and in other areas across the land. Indeed, every soldier and sailor's monument that we've looked at shows this symbolism to an extent. But what is this really reflecting? It's almost as though this is pointing back to another period of American history. Now, of course, we'll be told, no, that's not true. It's merely a sign of symbols that alludes to the myth and the folk art that represents what the United States was truly about. Consider the Lewis and Clark expedition. The United States doubled in size when it had the Louisiana Purchase, when it purchased that area from France. And President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark, 2 U.S. Army officers, on an expedition to the Pacific to map out the terrain. Oddly enough, the French, who had been there for hundreds of years, had never bothered to map it out, or perhaps Napoleon didn't want to throw maps in the deal and just wanted to sell the land as fast as he could. Although it's now understood that what selling the land meant was that the United States could actually go and, how shall we say, occupy it, but we'll just call it what it is, conquer it, as there were Native Americans that were there, and we have the account of their guide, Sacagawea. And there were many other guides that supposedly took part in the Lewis and Clark expedition. But what was the real intention behind it? Do you just send a small party to go and explore and actually bypass a lot of the land that you're in, or were they looking for something else? There's a lot of anomalies when you go through this particular path that these individuals traveled on, and what's the real historicity behind this? Now, there's a lot of debate between the purposes of this expedition. It has been agreed upon, but if you ever go to Montana, you'll find that there's a lot of interesting sites that are there. Now, of course, we'll be told that these are just simple natural rock formations and that Montana is a very beautiful state, and there's certainly no arguing that point. Yet if you ever travel through it, you'll find that there's many of these odd examples with rocks, or rocks that some might be forgiven for thinking are not necessarily built by nature. There's many supposed surviving maps and first-hand accounts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, such as this, less than well-kept manner of notes in a map. That gives you the idea of what their expedition was really about and what they were focused on. And then you have other maps that were obviously more well decorated and, how shall we say, well composed, with more effort being put into scientific and accuracy with the distances and the locations and in terms of what they are researching. This is the Sergeant Floyd Memorial, and a very strange obelisk that exists near Sioux City, Iowa. And you might be surprised to know that there is something that is a smaller version of an obelisk of the Great Washington Monument in Sioux City, Iowa. Oddly enough, there's still the little commemoration that we have on it. They call it a shaft, and it's to mark the burial place of Sergeant Charles Floyd of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Died in his country's service, buried 1804. And then we see that graves of such men are pilgrim shrines, no class or creed confined. And it was erected in 1900 by the Floyd Memorial Association, United States and the state of Iowa. Very interesting, again, an almost mythical association with this incredible structure that still exists near Sioux City. They built this in 1900. Well, how come every set of veterans, especially from the Great War and then the War to End All Wars, which is the same war in World War II, didn't get such wonderful monuments such as this? Well, this was Sergeant Floyd from the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and I suppose for some reason he deserved a great obelisk, and I'm certainly not denigrating the character of his service. I'm just saying it's a very impressive monument for one single individual. And yet we do have some construction photos of it, if you can call this a construction photo. Maybe you can. There's some peculiarities with it where it shows them allegedly finishing constructing the top of the monument. You'd think there'd be a better quality photo in 1900, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't have a very good camera at that time. And you can see, though, on the early maps at the end of the expedition, they still had Floyd's grave marked. I guess the officers were very fond of this Sergeant Floyd. He really did his job quite well. I think of all the other non-commissioned officers, though, that have lost their lives in the service of the United States. There's many other aspects that reflect the myth and the folk art of the United States from the 1800s, and they give the impression of the concept of what was called manifest destiny. Yes, manifest destiny, apparently a strategic influence or a strategic goal of the United States to settle all the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's really hard to pinpoint, though, the actual origin of this strategy. You could almost say that it almost seemed preordained, and indeed Manifest Destiny almost says it's preordained. And indeed the individual that coined the term, we don't actually have a picture of him, we just have a sketch drawing of Mr. John O'Sullivan. I find that very interesting, that the individual that coined the term for a mythical strategic expansion westward. And we do have the same kind of symbolism that accompanies it, with deities and the overwatching of the settlers as they moved west into areas that were untamed with infinite amounts of resources and land. At least that's what we'll be expected to believe. And it's rather fascinating that on many of these images you'll see trains and tracks, and then you'll also see trains that are traveling across open land without tracks. So is that to give us the impression that they had to build the train tracks rather rapidly, or was it just artistic license? Not really sure, but it's interesting that that's what we have. We have a lot of paintings and a lot of mythology that accompanies this, even though the camera had been invented and was fully in use during the Civil War. Although we always lament our complete lack of combat photographs, that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, any more than the lack of photographs that really display manifest destiny really prove or disprove anything. Of course, people say that if you just have an image of a small western town or one of those shack towns of wood in South Dakota, which we've explored and we have some interesting accounts behind, it gives another conflicting account. Ah, yes, Lady Columbia, who can forget, the great deity of the United States. It's very fascinating that we have this Lady Columbia, or the Statue of the Republic as it was called in the Chicago World's Fair in the early 1890s. Once again, almost showing a completely different origin for the United States. Are we to simply take these as national symbols, or was there some other inspiration behind their creation? Why are they so prevalent, especially in buildings? It's one thing to do drawings and paintings of all this, but when you lay out manifest destiny and the fact that all these structures were built very quickly in a short time frame in the 1800s, they all display these symbols. Now, of course, we have our theories that this could potentially represent a different origin for the United States. And perhaps that's what we really have to consider, that there is a different ideological origin. We'll be told that the roots of the American Republic or democracy actually come from the Greek originals, or the practice of democracy in Athens, and even the Roman Republic. And yet, oddly enough, we do see a combination of symbols that give us different indications for what manifest destiny really led to. And indeed, now the United States has a reputation for being a nation of excess, and yet it still claims to defend and support democracy. Here's a chart showing the estimated number of pioneers departing for Oregon, and you might recall our exploration of Seattle, where we saw a very tremendous growth of population within that particular area of the country. The population growth of Seattle from 1860 to 1960. And we're supposed to take this mythological interpretation of paintings and drawings along with these official documents and brochures that encouraged everybody to go west. Because you went through a hard journey to come to the United States from Europe, so you may as well go on another hard journey to go out west and tame this untamed land where there was no existing infrastructure at the time. And indeed, the railroad map is quite limited in terms of how much railway mileage there was in the United States in 1875. Of course, in the next 30 years, they quickly increased that exponentially, and let's not forget our changing of the rail gauge of 11,500 miles of rail in 36 hours. But remember, it was the 1800s. There really weren't any logistical limitations. They managed to build all this infrastructure, all these railways, all of these bridges, and all of these tunnels in a very short amount of time, as the map does indicate. 1776 to 1876. A series of wondrous achievements. A nation that not only was brought about by being a breakaway colony. And consider the wars that this nation fought. The War of 1812, constant conflicts with Native Americans, the Mexican War, and the U.S. Civil War. We saw the United States military struggle quite a bit in the War of 1812. And indeed, it frequently struggled in its conflicts with the Native Americans. The legend of the last stand of Custer endures to this day. Somehow they managed to improve, though, in the Mexican War and then in the U.S. Civil War. The point being is that there were a series of very brutal conflicts, and yet it seems that the United States had its strategic mentality in mind, and that the United States Civil War was going to be fought so that the United States could achieve a more perfect democracy, and coincidentally it could also achieve a more centralized government. But let's think about that, because we're told that prior to the United States Civil War that the American states, such as Iowa, Georgia, they were really the representation. It's in the title of the United States. That, in other words, state identity or states' rights were what mattered to people. Well, perhaps the best way to look at that is in flags, and we're told that the United States needed to have a flag in 1777, and here we have George Washington with Betsy Ross approving the original design. But what exactly did the states have in the early period of the United States? So we would expect every single state in the United States to have a state flag, especially once they became a state, but you may be surprised to know that that's not the case. For example, we'll look at Minnesota in 1893, the first Minnesota state flag. In 1893, the Minnesota delegation to the Chicago World's Fair held a contest under the auspices of the state legislature to design a Minnesota state flag. The flag was intended to serve as a promotional tool for the state at its exhibition pavilion in Chicago. Amelia Hyde, Senator of Minneapolis, submitted the winning entry. So we have a competition for our state flags, and I'm rather surprised to know that they didn't have a state flag for Minnesota. What about the Civil War? Well, when you look up here on this site, you're told that Minnesota's Civil War battle flags, in keeping with Union custom, several Minnesota regiments carried blue battle flags with a state seal in the center, including the 1st Minnesota, which fought at Gettysburg and endured great casualties, but certainly not because of General Hancock, and the 2nd, 4th, and 5th Minnesota. Most other Minnesota battle flags, however, had the American Eagle at the center by federal regulations. Many of Minnesota's battle flags are today displayed in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, that's Minnesota. Let's look at Iowa. Iowa was one of the primary states of the Union, and sent nearly 10% of its population to fight in the Civil War, the war between the states. What's the origin of its flag? Well, they didn't have their flag until 1921. What? Iowa did not have a state flag until 1921? That's what official history says. There was a false flag that was apparently used by a tobacco company, but it wasn't the real official flag of Iowa. So let me get this straight. Iowa, one of the most, how shall we say, supportive states of the Union, and yet we're told that prior to the Civil War, states' rights and states' identity was so paramount, didn't even have a state flag until the 1920s. They didn't even have one for the World's Fair, and we know that Iowa had some great displays in the Chicago World's Fair, but they didn't have a state flag. How would anybody know about Iowa? Let's look at one of the southern states or former states of the Confederacy and the flag of Georgia. And indeed, you'll find that Georgia didn't actually have a state flag or anything like it until 1861. This is very strange. Well, let's just look at a timeline of all U.S. state flags, and you might be surprised to notice that virtually all of the U.S. states did not have any kind of state flag until the 1860s, which corresponded with the start of the Civil War. And indeed, you'll see that most of the states that did were the states that joined the Confederacy or seceded from the Union. Now, there are some exceptions, such as Hawaii and maybe a few others. New York, but of course, New York being the original port of entry to the United States and it being around since the 1600s, of course it would have a flag. But for the most part, none of the states had any sort of state flag until the 1860s. This seems to be in contravention towards what we'd expect with the identity of the states in the United States. So what's the point behind all this? The point behind all this is that despite having the paramounts of symbolism, none of the states bothered to have state flags. The United States had to have its flag for the American Revolution, though, but the states supposedly had this great identity, but for the most part, it didn't develop until the 1860s. That seems to give us a very different perception than what we're taught about the identity of the American states. But what are your thoughts on this discrepancy that we found? So let's close this exploration by looking at the works of Erastus Salisbury Field, an American folk painter, and this is supposedly a colorized daguerreotype. Does this really look like any kind of picture to you, though? Very strange, and this individual is considered an American folk painter, and he was primarily active from 1850 to 1870, although the exact datings of his works are quite interesting. What kind of picture does he give us of America? Well, when you look at some of his works, he has a very interesting style of realism mixed with some sort of aspect of idealism. And you're probably asking, all right, why are we looking at an American folk painter? Because folk art is something that it's not necessarily a true reflection of what's actually going on. It's merely showing us exactly what we have in terms of myth. Indeed, we're told that he focused a lot of his works on biblical and classical paintings, such as the Ark depicted here. Now, if we go off the official account, then sure, we could easily believe that, but this individual also painted aspects of American history. And so could this give us the impression that the Ark of the Covenant was in the United States at some point in time? Now, I could simply be leaping to conclusions, and there may be no reality behind it, but it's quite an interesting body of work that this Field provided us, or whatever his works was really representing, or were representing. This family portrait is rather interesting as well, and seeing some of the humanity in the images and yet some of the idealism. Isn't it intriguing when we think of what our perceptions of the 1800s are really like? And how do we form our perceptions of the 1800s? Well, I hate to say it, but the reality is it's from television shows, it's from certain paintings, and we'll look at folk art such as this. And this is where we'll derive our understanding of history from, because this actually puts it in image. And as we're constantly told, oddly enough by the United States Department of Defense as well, we're all visual learners. And so what are these images really representing? Is this the idealized individual from the 1800s? And indeed, he even did this interesting image that shows George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and some of the great Union generals, I say that with a little bit of sarcasm, from the United States Civil War, because while the military record of Ulysses S. Grant, who's depicted here, some of the other generals depicted on this painting don't exactly have the greatest reputation. Yes, of course, we have the old hand in the pocket. Why not? Very interesting representation, though, of Lincoln and Washington, and not typically how we're used to seeing them. Now, is this supposed to be some sort of real image, or is this just some sort of idealized image? And who do we have over here to the right? Well, this is supposed to be General Ambrose Burnside on the far right. Why is it we always have this reference to Ambrose Burnside? Because his military record during the United States Civil War was anything but remotely close to successful. Indeed, one of the most bloody, horrific Union defeats in the Civil War, the Battle of Fredericksburg, was brought about by this individual. There's also other odd artwork that Mr. Fields did, such as the Taj Mahal. Was there a Taj Mahal in the United States, or did he actually travel to India? Well, there's no real account of that, so why would he be doing an artistic rendering or look at the Taj Mahal? And then we look at some of his so-called biblical works, and yet we have another oddity with this, because is he really depicting biblical works? When you look closer at some of the detail behind this, though, there's nothing remotely biblical about this. This almost seems to give the impression of something a little bit more modern, or whatever was actually going on in the 1800s. Could it be that this is reflecting a different view of what truly transpired in the United States? Or again, is it just an ideal? Is it the fact that he really dabbled in different kinds of paintings and decided to do actual biblical representations and depictions, and also of Roman times? This is supposedly the army of the Pharaoh marching off, although how would anybody have any idea what the army of the Pharaoh marching off? And of course you'll tell me, well, he was just using his imagination. Of course he was. And speaking of his imagination, he did have a very unique painting called the Monument to the American Republic. This has to be one of the most unique and creative paintings I've ever seen from the 1800s. Where did this inspiration come from? Is this an amalgamation of different architectural stylings and paintings that he saw? Or does this represent something that may have existed in the United States? And again, I know you'll be saying speculation, but it's rather odd that during a time frame when people were certainly not encouraged to use their imaginations and had to be very pragmatic and very hard workers, because how else do you explain all that incredible infrastructure that was thrown up across the entire United States in under a 100-year period, then where was someone going off with their imagination being able to bring all this together? Or is it possible that this is a depiction of how something looked in the United States in the distant past? These very unique towers with all these columns. We're told that the artist was simply representing different folk art of America and showing American history. But why do they always call it the American Republic? And indeed, looking closer, you can see what's supposed to be historical events that are represented within the walls, on the columns, and yet we also still see the Roman Greco architecture. Well, you can easily hand-wave explain that away by saying, this particular individual, this painter, he liked to depict Roman and Greek origins in many of his paintings. So this doesn't necessarily reflect what was going on in the United States. But isn't it interesting we have such a conflicting account? What are your thoughts on the American Republic? What's the real history? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restudo Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining the U.S. Civil War, Technological Revolution, or Salvage Operation. We've examined the U.S. Civil War in numerous explorations in the past, and we return to it after numerous requests based on the last photo op that we looked at. And here we have this painting that depicts Robert E. Lee as the commander of the Union Army during the Battle of Hampton Roads between the ironclad CSS Virginia and USS Monitor. What exactly is going on here? Now, I recall seeing in a book where they said in a caption that this was actually a fictional account, or an account that if Robert E. Lee had actually taken command of Union armies. And in this image, this does appear to be Robert E. Lee, not General Mansfield, as others would say. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. We begin our exploration by looking at the H.L. Hunley and its crew. The H.L. Hunley, a Confederate States submarine. Very intriguing that we had submarines during the United States Civil War. A lot of people credit the invention, or at least the notoriety of the submarine, to Jules Verne's Captain Nemo and the Nautilus, and here we have numerous designs for the H.L. Hunley. It would make sense that the Confederate States would innovate a submarine. I'm certainly not questioning that. And yet we see a very impressive design, something that seems as though it's far ahead of its time. We consider the fact that submarines were quite prominent during the Cold War era, and we no doubt remember many of the Tom Clancy novels, and of course the movie Hunt for Red October. We're also told in the official account that the H.L. Hunley was the first submarine to successfully sink another warship, the USS Housatonic. Very intriguing, though, that we have this account and we have a recovered submarine. Is this something that's real? Well, there's something that we can interface with. At least we have images of it, and you can still go and see this in a museum to this day. Now, what could this possibly tell us about a connection? Was this really innovated by the Confederate States, or was this merely adapted or salvaged technology? We look at the prototype of the Hunley, and it almost seems more advanced beyond what was actually used. And we look at the different design types. Now, we could understand why the Confederate States would need to employ submarines. Here we even have reconstructions of what the crew's faces likely looked at. Somewhat morbid and somewhat intriguing that we always have this scientific ability to reconstruct various things. How accurate is it really? But it makes sense that the Confederate States of America would utilize a submarine because, as we're told in the official account, they had a vast discrepancy in terms of industrial capacity when compared to the North or the Union, and they had to modify their tactics, therefore employing the submarine. Although you look at this and you really have to give credit to the individuals that went in the submarine, because submarines were not a well-known or tested technology. We think of somebody stepping onto the transporter on Star Trek for the first time without testing it. And yet, here you can see we do have photos of this submarine. Now, was this really a submarine, or could this have been some other sort of underwater device? Because I've heard in comments before we've looked at the Hunley that maybe it was some sort of torpedo, and this is a recovered torpedo. We also have various personal effects of the crew that were recovered. Here we have this intriguing golden coin and other devices. We're told that this golden coin of one of the Confederate sailors, Dixon, stopped a mini ball and saved him during, I believe it was the Battle of Shiloh. We also have a very intricate gold pocket watch. We've always talked about that, about the use of pocket watches, and we're told that they were innovated, invented, and mass-produced right during the Civil War. And then, of course, they had the railroad chronometers. And then we also have this Union ID tag. Another interesting account. This is probably the predecessor to the current military's ID or dog tags, as they're known colloquially, although I don't think they call them that anymore. And strangely enough, we also have the Union's response, the USS Alligator. Now, I have a question about why the Union would be in such a rush to field a submarine if the conflict happened as we believe it did. It made sense for why the Confederates would want to field a submarine, because they were at a vast numerical disparity against the Union Navy during the Civil War, so they would compensate for that by innovating a submarine, and they did have one that pulled off a successful attack. So why would the Union need a submarine of its own called the Alligator? And we do have numerous plans, although we usually have the typical issues when we look at various plans. There are more plans, though, of the USS Alligator. Now, what was the intention behind this? Was this just because of the fact that the Confederates had a really neat and innovative weapon, so the Union had to have their own neat and innovative weapon that was essentially a knockoff of the same thing? And when we look at the ironclads, we'll see how that happened with the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. But yet, looking at these plans and considering the application for this, the only real surface navy that the Confederates had were blockade runners. So the Union Navy had a vast numerical advantage. They blockaded all the southern ports. This is what the mainstream account tells us. And the only way for the Confederates to run the blockade was to employ what was called a blockade runner. And so how exactly would this submarine have chased down a blockade runner and sunk it? It's very intriguing. Now, the career of the USS Alligator was not very long, and unfortunately it sunk shortly after it was innovated and fielded. But you can still go and dive and visit its wreckage today. So much like the Hunley, we know that it's real, or something is real. Although we certainly have to ask what's the true account, because it just seems strange that both of these navies would suddenly field submarines, brand new technology. It's also interesting when you juxtapose that over the overall account of the Civil War, because what we're told is that when the Civil War started in 1861 is that both sides didn't think it was going to last longer than 90 days. Indeed, you can even look in that in President Lincoln's initial proclamations about when they were actually going to call militiamen for service and the states to send their forces and how long they were called. Well, 90 days tends to be the number. And then, of course, well, it's going to be a much longer conflict. It's going to be a strategic conflict, so we need to blockade the South and use the Anaconda Plan, which was innovated by General Winfield Scott, who's quite an interesting individual who served in the War of 1812 and was still the commanding general of the Union armies by 1861, although he was afflicted with gout. So quite a couple fascinating accounts with these submarines. The Confederates employing a submarine that conducted a successful attack, although the submarine sank, and then the Union employing its own submarine. It did not carry out any successful attacks, and it sank as well. And you look at this design of the Alligator, and it's very unique, but is this something else where we're possibly looking at some other weapon system and not necessarily what we traditionally think of as a submarine? Is this just the way that they would try to explain this to us, that, yes, this is really a submarine? And here you have it with these intricate plans. And I think these plans right here probably give us the most interesting look at what the USS Alligator may have been or really was. So was this really innovative technology from the U.S. Civil War? Or was this something that was salvaged and pressed back into service? What ultimately makes more sense? Because there's a lot of innovations that suddenly seem to come from the Civil War, and it's safe to say that whatever version of history you believe in, whether you accept the mainstream account or you think there's an alternative account to history, you have to ask the question and realize there's always the pattern of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. And conflict always seems to be the catalyst for setting everything off. So when we need to field new technology or introduce new technology, if you follow me, to the overall population, then we use conflict. And I show this image again because it's quite intriguing to me, as it shows divers finding the wreck of the USS Alligator. And yet in the different depictions of it, it's almost as though the USS Alligator is more advanced than we might like to believe. Well, let's go on to the ironclad, the CSS Virginia from the Confederate States Navy. So not only did the Confederate States Navy field a very successful submarine, they also fielded the first ironclad. Ironclad, as they were called, because they were ships that were covered in iron. It seemed to be a very novel idea. And the Confederates had captured Gosport Naval Yard after the Union abandoned it once the Civil War started, and Gosport was just part of Virginia. And they raised the ship, the USS Merrimack, put iron on it, renamed it the CSS Virginia, and threatened the Union blockade in Hampton Roads. And it's a very famous battle. And there's even a very interesting movie called Ironclads that was from TNT from the early 90s that you can watch. But this gives you a cross-section of the CSS Virginia, and we're told that the concept of the Virginia itself was not really that innovative. All they did was they slapped armor on the sides and changed a couple different things with it, and that seemed to be all it really took to provide a ship that was so threatening to the Union that President Lincoln himself got personally involved with developing a counter ship or their own ironclad, because the CSS Virginia was invulnerable to the vast majority of the Union Navy, which was still at that time wooden ships, or so we're told, although we'll find a conflicting account of that in a second. And that as the CSS Virginia was being built, there was a fear that it was going to steam up the Potomac and then shell Washington. Although the funny thing is we don't really hear of any ironclads that made successful shellings of cities, but maybe it's because they hadn't put those nasty mortars on them. Well, the official account says that the CSS Virginia, with its iron, threatened the Union blockade in Hampton Roads. It sunk the USS Cumberland, a slope of war, and the USS Congress, a frigate, and then it was going to destroy the other three ships and then allow the Confederates to lift the blockade. We still have some interesting imagery, though, that shows us what happened when the CSS Virginia sunk. At least that's what the caption on this picture said. Not really sure what to make of it. What do you think when you look at images like this? What does it really tell you? And here we get another example of other ships that may have been fielded at that time. And it's also interesting when you look behind this ship that you can see the U.S. Capitol in the background. Very intriguing. So what are these pictures actually telling us? The other thing that I found interesting and I had just learned was, when I originally learned history, one of the concepts was the ship of the line, or a three-decked ship, or 3 decks of guns on a sailing ship. Here we have the smokestack to the CSS Virginia. I've never seen this image before. But anyway, back to what I was saying about the ships of the line. I never knew that the United States Navy had ships of the line, but apparently after the War of 1812, they did field a few. So that's kind of strange. So the CSS Virginia was a terrifying ship. It was considered a crocodile in the water, and when the Union ships engaged it, they couldn't dent it, or stop it, or scratch it. The Cumberland and the Congress failed to even damage it. And here you can see it in a model, and it's a very rudimentary design, but apparently it was very effective as a weapon of war, and it was certainly a terror weapon of war. One of those weapons that doesn't really have a direct military effect, but also has an extreme psychological effect. So the United States Navy fielded the USS Monitor, a ship that they managed to build in 101 days to counter the CSS Virginia. And the USS Monitor was a revolutionary design that had numerous inventions on it. And here we have different aspects of the plans, and I find this very intriguing that there are many different accounts of what the plans of the USS Monitor actually were. But you can see that it doesn't look like any kind of naval vessel that you'd expect to see, and it has the turret. And it was invented by this man, Swedish inventor John Ericsson, and he had been responsible for other inventions for the U.S. Navy, including the USS Princeton, and through some political machinations, so the mainstream account tells us, a gun that was designed by a competing designer exploded and killed a member of the president's cabinet. I believe the Secretary of War, no less. So Ericsson was out of favor with the U.S. Navy because he was blamed for it, even though he didn't construct it. But as the story goes, he was given another chance, and because they were in a bind, Ericsson was the only one who could build them a ship that could counter the CSS Virginia, the Union's own ironclad, the Monitor, in 100 days, which he managed to pull off. Here you're looking at the USS Destroyer, another very interesting design from John Ericsson. And it gives us a different picture that the technology is far more advanced than what we might like to believe. This whole concept of a rotating and revolving turret is very interesting in and of itself, because this is the primary concept to this day on modern naval ships, although naval conflict has changed quite a bit. It's more about carrier and aviation tactics, but during this time, this would be the evolution of weapon systems. And we also think about how a turret's applied in main battle tanks to this day, and this seemed to be the original concept of it, applied on a naval vessel with 2 cannons in the turret and a full crew. They also had a speaking tube and numerous filtration systems that were revolutionary for the time. Now, was the Monitor revolutionary in an invention? Or again, was this simply salvage technology that was cleaned up and pressed back into service the best that they could with what knowledge they had at the time? And one of the theories that we have on the channel is that while there may be some individuals or groups who have some idea of what happened after the reset, do they really have all the information, or are they kept in just as much in the dark? Or even worse, are they given erroneous information that's not true, and then because of the fact that they think that they're part of a privileged group, they're more than willing to protect the secrets of that which is not true, and then people question it. Here is a diagram that shows you the blockade that was going on in Hampton Roads when it was attacked by the CSS Virginia. Now, the CSS Virginia sunk 2 of the Union ships that we talked about, then it battled the Monitor to a draw, and the blockade was preserved. Interesting sketch here of Union Commander Captain, or I think he was Lieutenant John Warden at the time. And yet there's many different images of this individual, but we don't actually have a picture. So quite fascinating that Commander from the Union side didn't even have a picture. We also have the account of the Battle of Drury's Bluff, where the Monitor and several other Union ships attempted to shell a Confederate gun emplacement, and they weren't very effective at that. So what really does this tell you is going on? Are they struggling to figure out how to apply this technology that they recently salvaged and recovered? And let's not forget that just like the submarines, the Monitor sank in heavy waters during a storm. So you almost get the impression that they really didn't exactly know how to apply or use the technology. The Monitor was recovered, apparently, and you can see some images for what the turret looked like. So again, I'm asking the question, was this all technology that we just managed to innovate? That these great inventors who just came out of the woodwork, and in 100 days they invented and built a ship that was capable of stopping the CSS Virginia, but then it was not capable of surviving stormy waters, something that, naval ships are known to encounter quite frequently. Here's an image of the Monitor, and we can supposedly see some of the impacts of the cannonballs or the shells fired from the CSS Virginia. And again, I really wonder if that's the actual account, especially when we look at some of the indentations on that. Or could there be another explanation? Well, because of the Monitor, despite the fact that it sunk, but it did stop the CSS Virginia, the United States Navy suddenly constructed many types of these ships. They even had other ironclads that they constructed for the rivers. That we'll get on to that shortly when we consider that account. What is going on with this picture, though? Look at the eyes of some of these crew members on, I believe this is a picture of the Monitor, or at least it's one of the Monitor-type ships. Very bizarre. And then here, once again, we have 2, looks to be officers, scanning and showing the actual impact. But then the impacts of where we see cannon shells or cannonballs are inconsistent with the different images. So, once again, I'm not really sure what's going on. Are we looking at different ships? We're told that really only the Monitor battled the Virginia so fiercely, and it was the only ship that had visible damage on its turret. But did other ships have damage on the turret? And once again, we have that same issue. Is the damage consistent? Did they repair it? Did they replace the iron plates? Also very intriguing that nobody else in the world thought to put iron plating on their ships. You would have thought that the British might have thought to have done it on their ships of the line during the Napoleonic Wars. And I know what you'll be telling me, well look, they had Nelson. They didn't need to put iron on their ships. Funny how Nelson wasn't even mentioned during the Napoleon movie. But I digress. So we have these other images that show us the Monitor type ships, and then even some of the other ironclads. So the other ironclads where they put iron on the ships, and they were considered invulnerable at the time. It was revolutionary. Nobody had ever thought of it before. We had people thinking of steam power and an industrial revolution, but it wasn't until the U.S. Civil War that they really decided to start applying and putting iron on ships. There are accounts that Imperial Russia did it earlier in the 1850s, and I believe there was an account of a British ship that attempted it in the 1850s as well. But then we look at some of the other images that we have of the riverborne ironclads. So while the Union seemed scared that the CSS Virginia was going to steam up the Potomac and shell Washington, it seems like overnight suddenly they started producing a bunch of different ironclads, including these river ironclads or the city class ironclads, which the main designer was Mr. Eads, and you might remember him during our explorations of St. Louis. He was the one who was also responsible for building that mighty bridge that we saw that many people tell me is simply the effects of rustication. Apparently there are also a lot of people that were alive in St. Louis in the 19th century who are still alive today and saw this firsthand. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that either. But looking at some of these ships, we see that this is a very revolutionary design. Many of these ships do not seem to compare to the classic sailing ships. And so it's clear in the imagery that this is a true step forward in the revolution of naval combat. But was it really a revolution, or was it simply salvaging technology and putting it back into service for whatever real conflict was going on in the 19th century? Or rather, what conflict was going on that we're told is represented from the United States Civil War? And here we're looking at some of these city-class Union ironclads, which I seem to be able to construct many of them without much challenge. So it conflicts with the account that the CSS Virginia was unstoppable and that the Union couldn't quickly build ironclads. It seems as though they could, and here we even see another example of one of these double-turreted Monitor class vessels, which they also had. So it seems that once the United States Navy focused on it, they had no issue building all these ships, even though it was a brand new class. And here's another image of it where you can see the twin turrets. Now, is that, again, really what happened? Or did they really start to find and salvage some of this technology and put it back into service? Again, we have the strange landscape in many of these images. And here we have another image from another ironclad, and I don't think we're seeing any strange things with the eyes and the crew, like the gentleman back there on top of the turret with the canopy over it, and it's a good way to stay out of the sun. And then here you see a steam paddle wheeler, and it's covered in iron as well. So when you think about this and you really look at a lot of these images and you see some of the questionable things about them, you have to step back and try to look at the images as objectively as possible. We're told that these are representations of what happened during the United States Civil War. But what if these are images of something else entirely happening? Think of some other sort of military force or organized force that's been directed to do something, and that we're merely seeing their actions. Or maybe we're even seeing some other organized force that's simply trying to retrieve, salvage, and then press old technology back into service. Because really, when you think about it, what makes more sense? When you look at a lot of these images, and also the fact that you see a lot of questionable things when you look at the terrain, and that's always the thing that stands out to me in the Civil War photos. It always looks like the terrain is just desiccated and arid. And then we see these strange images of ships that just seem to be almost out of time in a lot of ways. And the official explanation is, no, we're seeing the Civil War, and that happened to be that one time there was a drought going on in Georgia, or other fertile lands just weren't doing well, and they had all these problems, and so that's why they did all this. I'm not sure. A lot of times I don't know what to make of the images myself, but it's interesting to look at them and try to ponder explanations for what we're really looking at. Here's Mr. Eads again, and here's an image of him during his older days, certainly after he had designed and personally built the bridge in St. Louis, or so we're told. Well, I even have individuals who tell me that it must have been a fire that burned down St. Louis, and that was in the 1850s. But again, looking back at these ships, just think about this if this is really representing something else. What if you're really looking at some sort of expeditionary force that's reaching the lands and is targeting certain populations for other reasons? And we can see it all across the lands. It's not just the United States during the Civil War, where we have vast ships being built in large shipyards with rather suspicious individuals looking around. Now, is this just as we believe? I mean, did you see the smokestacks there? There's also some questionable things going on with a lot of the shipyards when we look at the older images. And I don't think it's quite so easy to always simply explain it away as just saying, yes, this is the United States Civil War, and yes, this is nothing to see here. But when you look at something like this, there's almost something that seems to go beyond our normal expectations for where we were at the level of technology. Now, is this because we were told to expect certain things about where we were at the level of technology in the 1850s, 1860s? Are the images not dated properly? Or are we looking at something completely different? And if we are looking at something completely different, then what kind of questions do we need to really be asking about it? Well, we need to ask what we're actually looking at. We need to try to get an idea of what date it is. We need to make an estimate, because it could be that the images aren't dated properly. We're always told that there were vast technical limitations with photographs, and yet we see so many photographs that seem to defy these technical limitations. Look at that there with the construction of that building there and what appears to be a dock on the bottom left of the picture. We've seen that pattern before many times. And then, of course, you look at some of these other docks and you see things that seem to be a little bit more advanced. Now, we'll be told that this is an image from the later 19th, early 20th century. But again, those decades all seem to run together in some images. It's very difficult to ascertain exactly what time frame you're looking at, such as this facility right here. Are we looking at something from the 1890s, or are we looking at something from before the 1890s? Did the 1890s really happen when the 1890s were said to have happened? That's where things start to get very confusing. And again, when you look at the many smokestacks here in this image, and the ironworks, and I believe this is London, River Thames, and we can see many of these examples of these tremendous facilities. And we'll be told not to question it because these were innovative designs and it was because of the Industrial Revolution, and just don't ask too many questions and it all makes sense. And don't worry about the fact that we also managed to erect tremendous buildings well before the Industrial Revolution. There's always a legitimate explanation for it. One other interesting peculiarity with looking at the images of these city-class riverine ironclads is we're often given the impression that these were boats or ships that were not really built to last. And yet we do have displays that show how they're still around. Of course, the hulls look very, very rotten because they're made of wood, but the iron is still standing. So what's the true account of this? It's really hard to say. So let's move on and take a look at the Intrepid observation balloon. Now, we've looked at this many times with Professor Thaddeus Lowe and his observation balloon corps. Indeed, it was one of the earliest explorations on the channel. Exploration number 3. But there are some problematic concepts when we consider why the aerial balloon was used, because does it again point to a much more advanced technology that was once again recovered, salvaged, and pressed back into service for whatever real conflict was going on during the time we think of the 19th century? For example, we have a very clear and precise image of the hydrogen devices that provided the hydrogen for the balloons that Thaddeus Lowe used when he was conducting his observation missions for the Union. Even the images of Thaddeus Lowe seem to give a conflicted account, because are we really looking at the actual individual or merely a representation of them? Because we oftentimes look at these individuals and we see many different looks in some of the images. Here's another image of the good Thaddeus Lowe. And of course, the story was how he had managed to sell his brilliant idea of using observation balloons. And if you really think about it, it would provide a wonderful tactical advantage to the Civil War, as we're told it happened, with its Napoleonic tactics of fighting in open battlefields, at least until the end of the war, according to the mainstream, when the Confederates started using trench warfare tactics. But of course, we'll look that they didn't innovate those tactics. There's photo evidence, actually, of the Crimean War, which occurred well before the U.S. Civil War, where they were using trenches. Apparently, they even reenact using Thaddeus Lowe's observation balloon. So maybe you can go and see that reenactment and ride on the observation balloon and pretend you're Thaddeus Lowe. Now let's go to the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun, or the father of the machine gun, as it was called by some historians, properly or improperly so. The Gatling gun was certainly something that changed everything, although it was not favored by Union commanders. Now, this was a rapid fire. Really, it was the predecessor to the machine gun. Crank operated, and it could put a lot of rounds downrange very quickly, especially when compared to the musket rifles at the time or whatever other rifle systems or weapons they were using. But commanders weren't particularly fond of it in the Civil War, and why? The answer we're given is because of the ammunition consumption and logistical limitations. Yes, you heard that properly. A new revolutionary weapon system was not favored because it used too much ammunition. And there were logistical limitations. It's very rare that we hear about the consideration of logistical limitations in the Civil War. And don't you find that strange when we have all these armies that were living off the land for long periods of time, but the ammunition supply would break down? Now, there are other accounts of Gatling guns being used during the Plains Indian Wars, as it was called, and the fact Custer didn't take the Gatling guns with him, and it might have made a difference in Custer's last stand. No, it probably wouldn't. Custer definitely seemed to have an idea of losing, and some people are supposed to lose, if you know what I mean. But when you look at some of these images, and you think about this other piece of technology that, once again, was found and put back into service. And things get even more interesting when we consider this Gatling gun originally being crank operated. You know, you just had an operator that would turn the crank and the weapon would fire as the barrels would spin. But this was not just a weapon system and a design that would be lost and neglected at the end of the 19th century, as many would think. And here it looks like we even have British soldiers employing this type of weapon system. So it seemed to be very effective once everybody got over the logistical limitations, and the design was brought back in the 1960s by the United States military and fielded in a variety of means, even a shoulder-carried version, which you might recall famous individuals or people that might be wrongly thought of as famous, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jesse Ventura, using them in films such as The Predator, Terminator, and so forth. And the minigun, the 7.62 version, called mini because there's a larger version that's often used by attack aviation and aircraft and other fighting vehicles or armored fighting vehicles for the Army. And here's an example of a helicopter door gunner using one during Vietnam. And this was considered a very effective rapid-fire weapon. This could put a lot of rounds downrange, and yet this is based on the exact same design from the original Gatling gun. In fact, the minigun was even used on the Batwing in the 1989 film Batman. Yes, he had miniguns mounted on the Batwing. And even had an advanced targeting system that Batman used to target the Joker and conduct a strafing run on a very stationary target. Although either the targeting computer was broken or Batman's just a lousy shot because he missed with 10 seconds of strafing run. And if you look up how many rounds put down range, you can find out how many times he missed until he was shot down. Okay, moving on. The bulletproof vest. Apparently there was a bulletproof vest concept that was used during the United States Civil War. One of the questions that gets brought up whenever you go on a Civil War reenactment or one of those historical presentations, or you encounter an annoying historian, such as I used to be, they ask, why didn't the Union or the Confederate soldiers wear body armor? Well, apparently they did. In fact, this individual, Colonel Albert Brackett from the 9th Illinois Cavalry, was saved by his bulletproof vest. There was an account that he took a hit directly in the chest and he survived. And you can see he's doing the Al Bundy pose, or at least the Al Bundy pose in the 19th century with a hand in the coat. I'm surprised this guy's name wasn't Captain Sam Beckett. You might have noticed they said his rank was colonel, but yet in that previous picture he was wearing captain insignia. So I guess at least Captain Sam Beckett here was wearing the proper rank insignia based on his rank. But I digress. There were also accounts of Union armies living off the land for some of these elaborate expeditions. Indeed, some expeditions that didn't go so well deep into Arkansas. And then we have the famous Sherman's March to the Sea through Georgia. And now let's move on to the concept of trench warfare. So one of the big innovations from Civil War towards the end, the United States Civil War, is trench warfare. A lot of people seem to indicate that, yes, they invented trench warfare during the Civil War. Although there are accounts of many other nations using it. When you look at the images from the Crimean War, which we will in a moment, you can see that it's very clear that they were using trench warfare in the Crimean War. So again, why would it be such a revolutionary concept to dig trenches like this? But a better question I have is, how exactly did they manage to dig trenches like this? In modern militaries, when they dig fighting positions for armored fighting vehicles, it takes D7 dozers quite some time to do it. And we're to believe that these very deep and elaborate trenches were all dug by hand. How long were they in these static positions? And why would they need to do this anyway when they had these forts that are very geometrically precisely shaped all over the place that they would fight from? Yet you have many different images. Oh, look at that. This is from the Crimean War, and it looks like the British Army had the nuclear-capable mortars that the Union Army did. You know, the ones they used to level many cities in the South that we've looked at many images of in the past. But I really wonder, consider the amount of dirt that had to be moved in these elaborate trench systems. Was this all done by hand? Was this all done in a reasonable amount of time? Were these all just static positions like World War I was? Because that was the most famous instance of trench warfare. And the reason we're told those trenches got so elaborate was that the lines didn't move. In other words, one side didn't advance that far and the other side didn't advance that far. It was very static. And from a military historian's perspective, World War I was very depressing because for the concept of soldiers being stuck in trenches, you have all kinds of problems. It rains, you have immersion foot, there's rats, there's all kinds of horrifying accounts of it. And there's probably a reason why you don't see Civil War reenactors doing the whole trench warfare thing, or really reenactors doing anything from World War I, at least in terms of reenacting the trench warfare. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, I've just never come across it myself. Let me know in the comments if you've seen someone reenacting trench warfare. It's very interesting. So the whole concept of trench warfare. The real question, how exactly did they move all the dirt in those images? How long did it take? Were they just in those positions for all that time, much like they were in World War I? Are we to believe that those were static positions or installations? Very hard to tell. And now we consider the armored train concept. And we're told that the armored train concept was really innovated in the 19th century. You know, along with everything else, since it seems like pretty much the entire world was invented in the 19th century. I mean, they basically say that Tesla invented wireless in the 19th century, and that's now what we use on our phones and everything else, although who knows the veracity of that. I'm being a little facetious, but serious at the same time. So the armored trains came by a long time with the whole turret concept. You can see some advanced turrets on here. And it originally came from this, just a armored train car that was used, or a land ironclad, as it were. There's even an account, I'm trying to recall which battle it was, I believe it was the 7 Days Battle, when McClellan's army threatened Richmond, although he was unable to actually seize Richmond, as winning battles was just not something McClellan was really keen on. But we don't need to be bad-mouthing Ken Burns' hero anymore. I mean, his tragic figure. But looking at these many different trains and the way this evolved supposedly over time, did this really evolve, or was this a technology that, again, was already available? Now, we're told that by about World War II, modern militaries got away from the armored train concept. Someone asked me what I thought of the recent Napoleon movie from Ridley Scott, and I think this image here of Napoleon and the expression on his face adequately reflects the feelings and my perception of the film. Although I'll be honest, my real disappointment was we didn't get to see a cameo from the very famous Richard Sharp. But maybe in the next movie from Ridley Scott about Napoleon, we'll get to see it. Well, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Restituto Orbis channel, and today we're going to consider the perplexing example of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, a 1,000-year time period in our history that we're told occurred from roughly 500 to 1500 as we understand the current chronology. We won't consider the other chronologies as we don't want to confuse this. We're looking to explain this because of the fact that we believe that our reset date occurred from 1750 to 1850. So where does the Middle Ages fit in? Where does this castle that's actually the former state capital of Louisiana fit into this? Yes, many wonderful romantic castles that appear across the landscape, to include in the New World, where there shouldn't be any castles. The Middle Ages, it inspires us with its tales of chivalry and romantic and courtly love. And yet at the same time, there are conflicting accounts of ruthless campaigns, and we're told about how life was terrifying for 98% of the population, or the peasantry. And yet at the same time, despite these many different accounts of terror mixed with romantic chivalry, we have a odd fixation with the Middle Ages. It continues in our society to this day, and we see many examples of it in our fantasy literature. Today we're going to posit some theories in terms of where the Middle Ages actually falls in our alternative history timeline.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Officially, the Middle Ages are the period in European history traditionally dated from the fall of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire endured declines in population, economic vitality, and the size and prominence of cities. It was also greatly affected by a dramatic migration of peoples that began in the 3rd century. In the 5th century, these people, often called barbarians, carved new kingdoms out of the decrepit Western Empire. Over the next several centuries, these kingdoms oversaw the gradual amalgamation of barbarian, Christian, and Roman cultural and political traditions. The longest lasting of these kingdoms, that of the Franks, laid the foundation for later European states. It also produced Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, the greatest ruler of the Middle Ages, whose reign was a model for centuries to come. The collapse of Charles the Great's empire and a fresh wave of invasions led to the restructuring of medieval society. The 11th to 13th centuries marked the high point of medieval civilization. The church underwent reform that strengthened the place of the pope in the church and society, but led to clashes between the pope and emperor. Population growth, the flourishing of towns and farms, the emergence of merchant classes, and the development of governmental bureaucracies were part of cultural and economic revival during this period. Meanwhile, thousands of knights followed the call of the church to join the Crusades. Medieval civilization reached its apex in the 13th century with the emergence of Gothic architecture. From nowhere, really. The appearance of new religious orders, and the expansion of learning in the university. The church dominated intellectual life, producing the scholasticism of St. Thomas Aquinas. The decline of the Middle Ages resulted from the breakdown of medieval national governments, the Great Papal Schism, the critique of medieval theology and philosophy, and economic and population collapse brought on by famine and disease. So that's the official account of the Middle Ages, but what can we really say about it when we step back and look at it more holistically? I'll admit that when I was a professor and I was teaching lesson plans on the Middle Ages, I was always very perplexed at the mix of incredible architecture and the various explanations that we have for this supposed revival of learning and understanding during a time that were originally called the Dark Ages. We have certain leaders, such as Otto the Great pictured here, who followed Charles the Great, and Otto the Great was the Eastern Carolingian emperor who eventually became the Holy Roman Emperor and defeated the Magyars in the Battle of Lechfeld. We also have numerous examples of incredible architectural achievements that we're told are Gothic architecture. Although the foundation of Gothic architecture is quite intriguing, and we've considered it many times in our previous explorations, it seems to lack fundamental explanation. And there are many things that, if you really step back and look at it holistically, lack fundamental explanation behind the Middle Ages. For example, how is there an actual coherent recording of history when we have all these divergent sources? The official explanation will be given is it was simply the church. The church had their centers of learning, they had their isolated monasteries, and we even have accounts that many of these isolated monasteries actually preserved the civilization that was left over from the Roman Empire and the great time of learning from antiquity, that much longer period of time that preceded the Middle Ages, at least according to official history. The odd thing about the Middle Ages, though, is that with these conflicting accounts and these different governments and these different societies and all these what would appear to be apocalyptic events, and if you think about it, that's what the Middle Ages really represents, apocalyptic events. You had the rapid collapse of the Roman Empire, the final collapse of it. You had the destruction of many other numerous governments and many lives that were lost. And indeed, during the Middle Ages, we currently agree is the worst year in history, 536, for a variety of reasons, and you can find many videos on that. Yet somehow we're supposed to believe that with this and then the subsequent bubonic plague, or the Black Death that occurred, which wiped out over half the population of Europe, somehow the society managed to survive. Somehow learning continued to endure. And somehow Heath Ledger was in a movie about the Middle Ages where you got to hear many contemporaneous songs. And yet I still enjoyed that movie much more than the 2000s Robin Hood series on BBC. But I digress. So what's really conflicting about the Middle Ages? Well, you have to consider that you have all these different smaller nations and kingdoms that came out of the Carolingian Empire. The Western Carolingian Empire, which would eventually become France, and the Eastern Carolingian Empire, which over a long enough timeline would become Germany, albeit with very different developmental phases to both of them. And an odd fixation on centralization that seemed to occur. You also had these villages, the whole concept of feudalism, and peasants being associated with the land. And of course, there was innumerable conflicts. As always, conflicts, which accompany everything. Yet, despite all these difficulties, and one of the things that we don't consider about the Middle Ages, and I can't tell you how many college professors I've heard will tell you, it just simply stank. Yes, it really smelled badly because things weren't in a very state of sanitary conditions. The once great sanitary conditions that were present with the Roman Empire with their sewers and their baths were no longer present. You didn't have people that were bathing for a long period of time. You have this very divergent authority with the Pope and the influence of the Church, and yet at the same time, you have accounts of emperors such as Otto the Great who were conducting what was called investiture. At the same time, there were invasions that were always coming from the east, and that seems to be a recurring theme in the Middle Ages. All these terrifying invasions that were coming from the east, the Magyars, the Mongols, whoever. There was also the rise of Islam at that time, when Islam conquered all of northern Africa and even threatened Europe itself. And yet, once again, somehow, the Franks managed to stand off these invasions in the Battle of Tours, even though it seemed like there was no way they'd be able to do it. So these are just all the official accounts that we have of the Middle Ages, and if you actually try to question anything, things become problematic. Here's an example. The author of Le Morte d'Arthur, or the Arthurian Tales, Thomas Malory. We don't even know the historicity behind him. They can't identify him. You see television shows such as Robin Hood from the 2000s, where you're almost expecting Robin Hood to whip out a cell phone to call Marion. If you haven't figured it out, I wasn't exactly a fan of this show. And then, of course, you go all the way back to the beginning of the Middle Ages with the depictions of Byzantium and the supposed rise of civilization. Here, you have Emperor Justinian pictured, and to his left is the great General Belisarius. Now, could it be possible that these individuals, whether we're talking about Belisarius or Otto, actually reflected real historical individuals? Where did the Middle Ages actually fall in our understanding of our alternative history timeline? Because we believe that a reset occurred from 1750 to 1850 according to our current 5 eras timeline. And yet at the same time, we have this very well-developed history of the Middle Ages, even though if you actually think about it and analyze it objectively, it should be very conflicted. In other words, it should be very difficult to figure out exactly what happened. Because if every single kingdom was keeping its own historical account, then shouldn't it conflict with the other kingdoms? And then you have this problem of the Florence Cathedral in what is today Florence, Italy, which today still has the largest stone or brick constructed dome. It's funny to me that they say it's all brick. In the world. Yes, in the world. There is nothing that exceeds this wonderful architectural achievement. And it should be noted that this was not completed during the Renaissance. This was done during the tail end of the Middle Ages. And yet they try to tell us that this dome was what started the Renaissance for reasons unknown. And yet at the same time, we can find many other conflicting accounts of the actual history of the Middle Ages. But we have to look a little bit more closely at what remains, in addition to the buildings, to understand what was really going on. And I think that involves looking at the art of the Middle Ages. What do we have here? A couple of knights dueling and then a couple of horses hugging each other? There's a lot of bizarre artistic impressions from the Middle Ages, and of course the first question we have to ask, as these are just images, did these images really originate from the Middle Ages? Because they give us a variety of conflicting accounts, and it's very odd when we're told that the church had a lot of power, even with the schisms, and of course we also have conflicts in that. For example, we're supposed to understand and accept that the Albigensians, the Gnostics in southern France, were completely crushed and destroyed by the Catholic Church. But yet at the same time, Lutheranism managed to rise and develop on its own because, for whatever reason, its beliefs were more palpable, and the Catholic Church couldn't put them down for whatever reason. In many of these works of art, though, you have strange things, hybrid creatures, odd chimeras depicted in many different ways. And it gives you the account that there's something else going on. Of course, we'll simply be told that this was merely the wild imagination at the time of a scared population. But who was really doing artwork like that at the time? Random chroniclers? Random people who were just trying to survive at the time? The interesting thing is when you look at the other civilizations that were around across the land at the same time, you also have this odd series of accounts where there appears to be this overall theme of apocalyptic doom and destruction that wasn't just afflicting Europe, but the rest of the land as well. There seemed to be odd changes within the land and the very nature of the land. There also seemed to be a variety of threats. And yet to this day we have many conflicting accounts with the Middle Ages, such as the depiction of dragons? Now, of course, this would just simply be seen as a fantasy element or the wild imaginations of the people at the time. Again, imaginations of people who were very suppressed and were told that they had to believe a very specific way, and if they didn't believe a very specific way, then they were killed. It was rather simple. And we're told about the various manners in which the church had in enforcing its will and its desire for people to believe. You either believed or you died. And yet at the same time, there were people who were allowed to think differently. There were the rise of alternative religions, and this all did occur in the official account. And again, this wasn't just in Europe. There were schisms in the other major religions of the world at that time. So what to really make of it? It's really just difficult to ascertain exactly what was going on because we do not have a reliable historical account. And I think that's one of the hardest things for us to truly grasp. And a lot of people have to have something to grasp as a reliable historical account. They need to have the actual history. And this is where you find the difficulty in understanding history, because there's a concept in history called historical revisionism. And I've lampooned it a couple times in the past because it oftentimes feels like you're just being picked up by your feet, swung around the room, and then dropped off at a different place, and you're not exactly sure what to make of things. And yet, this is exactly how the mainstream regards the history. For example, are these images that you're looking at right now, are these actual works of art from the Middle Ages, or are these works of art that were produced subsequent to the Middle Ages? Because the odd thing is, a lot of people often thought that the Middle Ages would go all the way up to the 1700s. It was just a perception that people had. And yet at the same time, you do see a great variance in the works of art, the scope and the imagination. Now, oftentimes the explanation will be, well, this was just the Renaissance. There were many polymaths that were suddenly born out of nowhere, and they decided to start studying the forbidden texts of Greco-Roman history and looking into their society or the writings of antiquity, which if you ever watch the film or read the book The Name of the Rose, you'll see that those works were considered forbidden, because they represented a time of civilization before the civilizing facets of Christ and all the prophets that subsequently succeeded him. It's really odd, though, when you consider some of the other aspects of the Middle Ages, because they want you to believe that they had a very definitive system of learning, that there was an explanation for how they were able to construct these incredible cathedrals of this wondrous Gothic architectural style. What's going on here is this lady taking her giant Komodo dragon for a walk, and it ate somebody, and the local guards had to kill it. You have many strange depictions, though, in artwork of the Middle Ages, and some of my earlier explorations involved looking at them and analyzing them. And yet you see a vast variety of creatures and odd demi-humans that are depicted in many of these works of art. What do these represent? Are these what the people really saw at the time, or is there something else going on? You even have many depictions of great epic battles of men against snails. Not exactly sure what was going on. Did we have a great snail invasion, or did that represent something else? And I'm not being facetious at all. These are the kind of things that you'll see in many of these supposed works of art that supposedly originated from what we think of as the Middle Ages. So you take it all in totality. You look at the official history that we have of the Middle Ages. You have all these portents of apocalyptic doom, especially with the bubonic plague, which reduced the population of Europe by 50%. And do not ask how the society managed to survive that. Don't consider it. It just happened, and you're just supposed to take it without even asking any questions. Indeed, they've even gone so far now as to tell us that during the Middle Ages, even though we're told that Columbus had the revolutionary idea that the earth was round, they try to tell us in these chronicles that they all knew and believed that the earth was round. Quite interesting. Round or spherical. I mean, it's funny how those two seem to be confused, and there's even a play on that in the name on this channel. Yet you have stunning and stellar works of detailed art and sculpture, which if they were carved would take a lot of time. You also have unrelenting, unique, artistic depictions that almost show a very different people than we'd expect to see. And we have that account where the people of the Middle Ages were very worn down, that they were sick, and yet at the same time we have other depictions that show people being very healthy and very, almost dare I say, superhuman in many different ways. Here in this depiction of Joan of Arc, and the historical figure who led the French armies in a great victory in the 100 Years' War over England, and finally forced England to withdraw from northern France. Although there's conflicting historical accounts that say that Joan of Arc was merely a standard bearer. Of course, you shouldn't let that be held against anybody because a standard bearer will win you the Medal of Honor, such as Arthur MacArthur in the Civil War. At least so we're told. The really unique thing, though, is how many different depictions that you have of artwork from the Middle Ages, and you have to look beyond Europe and see some of the depictions that came from the Byzantine Empire, as they called it, although they considered themselves the Eastern Roman Empire. Although one of the questions I always ask that got myself in trouble with many of my department chairs is, how exactly do we know that they called themselves or considered themselves the Eastern Roman Empire? Of course, they use the term Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire, and what does that really reflect? Many odd concepts also reflected in the spiritual depictions of the Middle Ages, and sometimes people will say that these depict something else, greater technology or some sign of spiritualism that's depicted in this artwork. What do you make of this? What do you make of all these conflicting and yet very imaginative depictions during a time when we're told that imagination was not something that was encouraged, that you either believed or you died? We've all heard of the Inquisition. And yet at the same time, we see these wonderful mosaics, such as of Empress Theodora from the Byzantine Empire, the real power behind the throne, the real will that was behind Emperor Justinian and his desire to reconquer many lost lands in Western Europe. And then you also have these other interesting accounts that supposedly show the piety of religion, and yet at the same time, it almost looks like we have the birth of Superman being depicted here. We have no shortage of images, though, that show that there seemed to be an apocalyptic scourge that was upon the land. Many people facing terrifying situations and facing their internal fear in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. Yet you also see incredible and stunning works of art that cannot be equaled to this day, no matter how much we're reassured that we could do this with our modern machinery. And we have other reasons for why we can't replicate this. These stunning and very inspired works of art, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or what we're told is a sculpture or a painting. Who knows what the actual means were, though, that actually produced these stunning works of art. We also have the entire concept of individuals who somehow preserve knowledge, even though we're told that that very knowledge was forbidden at the time. So it really comes down to the fact that if you take the Middle Ages at face value, you have so many conflicting accounts and you have so many different perceptions that it really seems as though one individual simply stood up and said, this is what happened and this is what we're deciding actually happened. Because there's no way that you could have a single account from all these different monasteries, all these different individuals, and don't tell me that someone in the Catholic Church just stood up and said, yes, this is what happened from 500 to 1,000, and this is exactly what happened. It was asking questions like this and trying to deconflict this with all the conflicting accounts that we had that initially got me into a lot of trouble with my department chair, because apparently these were questions that were not supposed to be asked. I mean, I thought they were very legitimate questions, and yet somehow history continues in our fantasy depictions of history, such as the concept of dragons. And why is it that we have a strong fantasy element in what we traditionally think of as the Middle Ages? Well, let's consider that connection of fantasy. Most of us had our introduction to the Middle Ages, or what we think of as the medieval times, through the concept of fantasy. And indeed, there is a very strong fantasy element in the Middle Ages that persists to this day, starting with the depiction of the numerous great creatures or dragons. Now, of course, we're told and assured by our mainstream history that there was no such thing as dragons that existed during that 1,000-year period of the Middle Ages. It was simply the fear of the people at the time. And yet at the same time, the romantic notions of the imagination of the Middle Ages made its way into our fantasy literature that's endured from what we're told the 1800s until the present. Whether you're looking at the Game of Thrones franchise, the Lord of the Rings universe, or many, many others, He-Man, Conan the Barbarian, there's too many to list, that have the actual existence and some of the nuances of the Middle Ages, such as knights fighting dragons, or knights fighting each other, or warriors or barbarians fighting each other, or some sort of civilization that existed at the time. And yet there are fantasy elements that existed in it. The presence of dragons, the presence of magic. And yet that's explained, again, by the mainstream account by telling us that there was an obsession with alchemy at the time. And it was merely the existence of alchemists and the misinterpretation or understanding of their purpose and role in society that we began to see them as what we'll think of as wizards in this fantasy world. And yet at the same time, I always find it fascinating that in these fantasy worlds you see stunning examples of architecture. And oftentimes the stunning examples of architecture barely match or do not match what we have in reality. Many of the castles that still stand to this day, or Florence Cathedral, which you can go visit, and you can see exactly the examples of what the people were able to achieve in reality that still stand to this day. Again, if we take the mainstream account at face value. Yet all these accounts and all these legends and artistic depictions of dragons, whether it's in our current fantasy literature or whether we're actually looking at works of art that supposedly originated from the Middle Ages. And the whole concept of just having a pretty fantasy castle that's on a ridgeline or in an isolated, beautiful area. But yet at the same time, we're told that that's not the reality. The people lived in squalid conditions. The peasants were essentially in a post-apocalyptic state. So what's reality? Was there really a time where there could have actually been dragons and these wondrous kingdoms that existed, where we had strange creatures that roamed the land? Is that really what was being depicted in these works of art from the Middle Ages? So many different questions, and yet oftentimes we're just simply dismissed when we ask these questions, and we're told that these were a frightened people. These were people who had a very short lifespan, and there were only three classes of society in the Middle Ages. There were the knights, there were those who prayed, the clergy, and there were the peasants. And those were the three main classes of society, and 98% of the people were the peasants. So who exactly was enacting their imagination then in the Middle Ages to come up with these fantasy concepts and all these works of art that somehow endured to this day and inspired the modern fantasy literature that we still have? Game of Thrones is probably the most well-known and current contemporary example, and it's a show that's still continuing to this day. And perhaps one day the author will finish the books, but, he has no commitment to do so. But you can find in what we're told are authentic works of art from the Middle Ages the depiction of all these fantastical creatures that there's no shortage of, whether it's a dragon or whether it's some sort of strange, bizarre hybrid or chimera creature, a mixture of human beings with animals. So many different strange accounts and so many odd aspects of the Middle Ages that seems to have inspired, oddly enough, our modern depictions of it. I mean, if you think about the very essential roles that dragons play in the Lord of the Rings franchise and the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire franchise, dragons are essential to both of them. Now, granted, their application and use varies quite a bit, but why are they such a prominent creature? And why do we have such a powerful depiction that somehow came about in our mainstream current fantasy literature? Was this inspired by works of art in the Middle Ages? For example, the whole concept of the wizards and wizards such as Gandalf that appear in Lord of the Rings. Are they merely the representations of alchemists? Was Gandalf simply the modern-day Merlin from an author that we can't actually pinpoint existed? There's a lot of debate about who Thomas Malory was. Was he really some English knight who was a prisoner? Or was he someone else entirely? Or did he even exist? These are the kind of questions that you have to ask. Because when you step far enough back and you see many of the inspirations of fantasy within what we think of as Middle Ages, or should we say the inspirations of the Middle Ages in our fantasy, then we see that there is a very conflicting account here. We have to realize that there may be a very different explanation than what we're told as being that this 1,000-year time frame, yes, it's always 1,000 years, isn't it, occurred from 500 to 1500, or at least the time frame that we understand. And yet we can look at our great depictions of fantasy, such as in the Lord of the Rings series, where we have giant eagles fighting giant dragons. Did that really happen? Again, going back to the whole concept of dragons, the great mythical creature. And yet you can find other allusions to dragons in all of the mainstream society's historical accounts. Very strange. And you can also find the actual allusion to the existence of such fantastical creatures as being something that continues to inspire our imagination to this day. You'll continue to see films, whether they're animated, live action, or computer-generated imagery, which I think of as animation, that will continue to depict and display dragons in many different ways. And we consider the fact that these creatures in some franchises are thought of as evil, and in other franchises they're not. In the Middle Ages, it'll simply be explained as being a representation of the devil. The dragon was just that, a representation of the devil to a society that was scared and frightened. And at the same time, you can find other depictions of dragons in other societies and other civilizations where you might not think that they existed. So why are there so many consistencies then? Conflicting accounts, and yet there are consistencies that we just simply hand wave away. We have the ability to see what remains in our society, and yet at the same time we're told to overlook it. We're told what exactly happened. Because even though Joan of Arc may have stormed a castle personally, there are other historians who were never there and never saw it, who say that she was simply a standard bearer. So who exactly knows? Did some version of Joan of Arc exist in the past? I have no doubt about it. I have no doubt, though, that the story behind it may be a lot more elaborate and a lot more amazing than we'd like to believe. Because oftentimes it seems that we have these incredible tales of great heroism from the Middle Ages, and yet at the same time, they don't work their way into our modern interpretation. We're told that everyone was not really fighting for chivalry. There was no real code of honor. It's something to be disregarded. People were simply doing what was best for them. And this existence of wizards, whether it's the wondrous wizards depicted in Lord of the Rings, that's simply the product of fantasy and imagination. And alchemists, even though we say that alchemy was a proto-science, it did exist. Oddly enough, you can find depictions from Noah's Ark of dragons even being brought aboard the Ark and offloaded from the Ark. Very interesting. And so again, if we consider everything in totality, where does this Middle Ages time frame actually fall? Did this really occur before our reset time frame? It's interesting, though, when we try to fit it into our 5 eras theory where the Middle Ages may have occurred. Because we look at our 5 eras theory and we suspect that the reset occurred sometime from the years that we think of as 1750 to 1850. Although, remember that we don't know the actual timeline, and there could be an entirely different interpretation of what the years really were. So where were the Middle Ages? Did they actually start at the beginning of our contemporary era? Is everything exactly as we're told? I always consider that possibility, although I have to admit that with continued explorations, I begin to find it less and less likely. And I find that concept constantly reinforced with every exploration. Now there may be conflicting evidence, and I certainly invite you to let me know in the comments. Could the Middle Ages have actually been the beginning of the Tartarian era, or the 4th era? Could it have been an apocalyptic time that followed the reset of the 3rd era going into the 4th era? I strongly consider that possibility, especially if we consider the displacement of the fact that many of the events of the Middle Ages did actually occur. Or could they have actually been a time frame from somewhere in the Foundation eras, possibly right after the reset of the 1st to the 2nd era, or the reset of the 2nd to the 3rd era? Because there is a recurring theme within the Middle Ages that there seems to be an apocalyptic event that recently transpired. Now, of course, we'll be told it was the fall of the Roman Empire, but what if it was the fall of one of the pre-existing civilizations from the 3rd era going into the 4th era? And I strongly suspect that's exactly what it was. The Middle Ages were the beginning of the 4th era, and that's why it's very confusing. It's a displaced time frame. So it did really happen. And we consider where it was in the 4th era. We have our 3 phases of the 4th era: the inception and rise, the ascendancy and height, and the decline and the fall. We're going to be looking at the final decline and fall soon. But we consider that in our current theory, in this channel, that the Middle Ages was actually the start of the 4th era. It was that very difficult time that followed the apocalypse, or the fall, of the 3rd era civilization. And it was the attempts by what elements survived of that civilization to bring about a new civilization. Again, we see the pattern in the cycles. Now again, this is just a theory. It could be completely incorrect. And yet we're also going to explore the concept of how what we think of as the Middle Ages managed to inspire our current fantasy literature, because we simply can't ignore that. We have many fantasy franchises that endure to this day that seem to indicate a very different origin, such as the stories of Conan the Barbarian, and we're going to explore that as well, trying to find explanations and examples and looking at the many different examples within the fundamental plots and the world building of many of these fantasy lands that we have, or A Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, there are many connections within both of these franchises that can be drawn to what may have actually transpired, whether we're going off with our 5 eras theory or our multiple realities theory. It just depends on what we want to look at. But there are far too many examples to simply ignore that these are just simply the products of imagination, because there seems to be an odd connection between what we're told really happened, and yet at the same time events that we're told are simply the product of imagination. How exactly would one know if we're just looking at written accounts? What was real and what was imagination? That's a question that oftentimes is dismissed by many people who are uncomfortable with considering the notion. But what are your thoughts? I invite you to tell me in the comments, and what do you think of these theories? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.